Our story begins in the great city of Texas, one of the largest cities in the world. A cold wind was blowing outside, and there was piercing darkness. In one of the houses, there was a man tied to a rope who showed no signs of life. His body was covered with scars, and his hands were tied. Some liquid was dripping from his mouth, his eyes were closed, and cold sweat was streaming down his face. We are transported into the memories of our main character, Jake. The episode begins with gunshots and shouts to kill everyone. There was a massacre. People were dying every second. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Screams were heard. Along with the smell of gunpowder, there was a thick smell of blood. Everyone had to die. No one was going to take hostages. The screams of people could be heard many meters away from the massacre itself. The ground was flooded with blood. The massacre was so bloody that the fire even reached civilians, children, women, and no one was going to take hostages. The sky absorbed the color of the earth, became bloody. Mountains of corpses lay on the ground, and the smell spread throughout the body until it made it tremble. Among the entire crowd, one man could barely stand on his feet. This was our main character. The man was next to a woman who was holding a small child in her arms and trying to protect him from death. The baby was exhausted. All his bones were visible. He was sobbing. His mother hugged him tighter and tighter. Jake's gaze was cold, but at the same time pitiful. His tears turned scarlet. Suddenly, the man woke up, panting alarmingly due to lack of oxygen. He opened his mouth and tried to pull higher. Drool flowed over his lips and screams were heard. His entire body tensed, every muscle trying to rise up to survive. Jake raised his legs to loosen the noose around his neck. He pressed his feet to the ceiling and pushed with all his strength. Suddenly, a rope flew out of the ceiling, and our main character fell straight to the ground. Lying on the ground, the main character did not show any signs of life for several seconds. His body was tense, when suddenly he grabbed it and began to spit, trying to inhale as much air as possible. A few minutes later, he lay down, held his breath, and exhaled with some bitterness. He was dissatisfied. There were 2 syringes and 2 pills on the windowsill. The syringes were empty, the needles were wet. Having pulled the rope out of his neck, the main character thought that he was useless because he could not die. Throwing a rope around his neck, the body of the main character appears before us, which speaks for itself that he has experienced a lot. It's a weekday, everyone is going to work, some kind of pain is felt on people's faces, and in the background on huge TVs, there is talk that some creatures have been discovered in some cities of your country. There is also a story going around in the metro that the police are doing everything possible to understand the reasons for the appearance of strange creatures. The population of the cities is in panic. The journalists showed what was happening in the cities and also added that the government would soon provide all residents with a shelter where they could hide from the monsters. The city is in turmoil. It would seem that until recently everyone lived a normal life, but everything changed literally overnight. The man, wearing a hood and trying to hide his face, remained thoughtful. Anxious cries of people were heard in the building. When he thoughtfully approached a shelf with some liquids, a cold sweat ran through his body. Someone was watching him. As soon as he drank water to quench his thirst, he heard some very strange sounds. They were rustling sounds. Suddenly, in the distance from the store, cries for help and screams were heard. A crowd of people tried to escape, some screaming for help, while others shouted for everyone to run and get out of the store as quickly as possible. The hooded man, looking at the rushing crowd, thought, but at the same time a smile appeared on his face. When the image of people tripping over each other suddenly appeared in front of him, a crash was heard. People were lying on the ground. Screams were heard when suddenly a monster with a knife jumped at them. Another monster appeared behind this monster. The man managed to get up and began to run away, shouting for someone to save him. The man with a hood on his head remained motionless. From the outside, one might think that he fell into a stupor after what he saw. The monster stood right above the man who was lying on the ground. He cried when he realized that this was his end. He could not even move from fear. 3 monsters were covered in blood. They were goblins. They were making some kind of animal roars. One of them had a knife. The other was holding a severed human hand in his mouth. And the third was enjoying the prey, looking at the lying woman. On the floor. The man was surprised. He didn't understand who they were. It even occurred to him that he had not yet recovered from yesterday's drugs. He couldn't believe what he saw. The goblins ran screaming towards him as soon as they saw him. They were driven by some animal instincts. They just wanted to kill. Suddenly, a creature attacked the main character, jumped up, making some strange sounds, trying to stab our hero with a knife. The man, looking back and seeing a strange creature flying towards him, took a deep breath. When he suddenly hit the goblin flying towards him right in the head, throwing him back several meters. The goblin, flying away in shock, did not understand how an ordinary person could resist him. Having sent the creature, incomprehensible to man, to flee, it fell upon 2 other fleeing monsters, knocking them to the ground. Jumping up from the ground, they looked at the unarmed man, screamed, shouted, and drooled, wanting to eat him. Behind Jake stood two more goblins, who were directly above the lying man, dousing him with their disgusting slime. Jake suddenly remembered that yesterday he did not use drugs, but tried to hang himself. But now he had even more questions about what these creatures were. Suddenly, the goblins standing behind our main character ran towards him, and with them the monsters who had come to their senses in front of him also headed towards the main character. They screamed and shouted, running towards our protagonist, looking like rabid wolves, driven solely by bloodlust. Our hero had experience in combat, so the attack did not bother him. He threw a bottle of water at one of the attackers, hitting him right in the head, and he fell. Suddenly a battle began. The goblins, one after another, moved away from our hero. He demonstrated high hand-to-hand combat skills. When suddenly one of the goblins was next to him, it seemed that Jake was done. But this was not the case. The man dodged. He was wondering what they were trying to do. Grabbing one of the attackers by the hand holding the bat, he punched the monster in the face. The blow was so powerful that even the second goblin behind him flew away. Jake thought it was a dream. At the moment of contact between the two goblins, the protagonist redirected the weight of his body to the side, thus throwing the two goblins straight to the ground. They couldn't stand up. Their injuries were painful. They couldn't even get up from the ground. At this moment, the goblins retreated one after another. Our main character threw them in different directions. His single blow was so powerful that even after one blow, they could no longer get up. When he suddenly grabbed the knife in his hands, his movement seemed so piercing that it could even cut through the air. Standing on the mountain of creatures, he swayed, thinking that he had wanted to die for so long, but he simply could not do it. But now he realized that fate was preparing him for this. Now he did not want to die, gritting his teeth and looking around coldly. Once he was sure that there was no one around him, he began to lower the knife towards the creatures with great speed. But throughout the entire store, sounds piercing flesh could be heard. There was a thick smell of blood. The sounds did not stop for a second. After a while, the sounds stopped. The main character rose from his knees and stood up. Slowly walking out, he could not understand what was happening, and behind him lay a mountain of dead monsters, their blood of an incomprehensible color. Adjusting his hood, he walked thoughtfully, trying to avoid prying eyes, breathing heavily. Approaching the entrance of the store, he saw that everything was destroyed. Because of his past, he realized what kind of house was happening here. He thought that the end of this world had come. Small blows of the bat were heard. The crunch of gloves on the handle was heard for several tens of meters around. Along with creaks and waves, screams were also heard. At first glance, a whole horde of goblins attacked the baseball player. He screamed for them to leave him. He wants to live, continues to swing and try to fight them. Like the others, he could not understand what these monsters were and where they came from, why they were trying to kill him. Fear was visible on his face. His face was covered with cold sweat. He thought that he might be training now, but no. He decided to run away from it. Was this some kind of punishment from his coach? When Blade's memories suddenly appeared before us, shouts were heard in the hall that he felt bad, and therefore he decided to leave training early. While trying to climb over the fence, he hears the coach screaming. Blade throws the bag over the fence and then jumps over it himself. Jumping up, he takes the bag in his hands and begins to run away. Running away, he says that he needs a good rest. He has had hard training lately, so he needs to rest. The young man ran away with a smile. Back in the present, Blade stops the blow with the key. The crash is heard throughout the internet cafe. But the devil's blow was powerful. He could not resist it and flew back. The recoil was so powerful that his whole body trembled. He falls and hits his head right on the shelf, the bat flying out of his hands. Scratching his head, the young man looked at the ground. The blow to the head was strong, so the boy came to his senses only after a few seconds. When he came to his senses, the goblins were already almost close to him. But suddenly an object flew towards one of the goblins. The blow was strong. It sent the goblin flying. Someone threw a frying pan at them. The falling elf fell on another elf running nearby, and they fell. When the main character suddenly appeared, his blows were so fast that it was not possible to really see his movements. But blue blood splashed throughout the store. Having finished off the fleeing monsters, he rushed to the two lying on the ground. The goblin was surprised, and he was also overcome with fear. Seeing the goblin's eyes, the main character wondered if these monsters could feel fear. Maybe they understand us. They died in an instant. Throwing the screwdriver to the ground, he exhaled heavily again. Adjusting his hood, he asked Blade if he was alive, and if so, he told him to follow him. Jason removed his hood and looked at the boy sternly, adding that if the boy wanted to survive, he must follow all his orders. Sweat dripped down Blade's face as he responded in a surprised voice. Well, He couldn't believe he survived, much less that anyone could face a horde of monsters. The main character, looking towards the baseball player, did not understand what Jason was seeing in the distance. When suddenly Jason ran to the side, the boy shouted at him to stop, but he didn't listen. The boy couldn't believe how he could leave him so easily. Grabbing the bat, he thought it was better than empty hands. Having caught up with the man, he asked him why he didn't wait for him. When he suddenly saw a huge monster, Jason's look spoke for itself. This monster was much more dangerous than all the previous ones. They were shocked by what they saw, because this incomprehensible creature seemed much more dangerous than those they had already encountered. Anyone could tell from Blade's eyes that the boy was very scared. Jason just looked at him in surprise. When suddenly a huge monster moved to attack the man, the guy couldn't even move. He was just trying to defend himself. At that moment, our main character was already running to his aid, grabbed his head and tried to save the unarmed guy. The monster noticed a man approaching him, who showed no fear. Jason's gaze was as stern as possible. With just one glance, he showed his advantage in strength. As soon as the monster was in the man's striking range, he hit him several times with the bat. The blows did not stop, wounding the monster one after another. It seemed that the monster was about to fall from the number of blows dealt to it. The blows were so powerful that a roar echoed throughout the entire store. The protagonist was a little surprised that his punches felt like he was punching a mountain. The monster, like a friend, grabbed our hero's bat, thereby preventing him from making another blow. His grip was so strong that he could break an iron bat. Holding a bat in his left hand, the strange creature tried to hit Jason, but he immediately dodged, bending down and jumping off the ground. Jason grabbed the racket, broke off part of it, and made a sharp stake out of the end of the handle. With quick movements barely noticeable to the eye of an ordinary person, the man struck the monster. The goblin screamed with incomprehensible squeals, trying to grab our hero. But before he can grab Jason, our protagonist hits the huge goblin right in the eye with the sharp end of a racket. The creature is confused, screams in pain, covers the wound with its hand, blood flows from the eye. The monster is furious with what is happening, because just as an ordinary person can fight him, he can also inflict wounds on him. The goblin becomes enraged. His scream is so loud that it covers the ears of many meters around him. For a second, even the main character hesitated, falling into a slight stupor from what he saw. Blade was still in a stupor and could not move as he watched what was happening. The lying people thought that their end had come. They could not move to save themselves. Tears flowed down their faces. The main character, grabbing the bat, exhaled deeply. At that moment, a creature had already attacked him. Its movement seemed so great that it was comparable to a stone falling directly on our hero. Jason, shouting incomprehensible sounds, raised the bat above his face. Thus, trying to deflect the goblin's blow, the bat squeaked again. The man flew backwards, his back hitting the shelves behind him. Our hero did not stand up, but the monster stood looking at the ground with his hand raised, showing his advantage. Grabbing the handle of the racket, the goblin noticed that the man behind him did not move. It was Blade. The creature, looking at the guy, took part of the racket out of his eye. Sweat ran down the young man's face as he thought about how things could have been different if he had stayed to train instead of running away. The goblin threw the racket aside. Blade began to shake in fear. Everyone around them understood that the only one who could protect them was dead or so wounded that he could not even move. The boy looked so scared that his eyes darkened. His mother thought the boy had died of fright. Blade begged his body to move, huge beads of sweat running down his face. His heart seemed to be trying to jump out of his chest, its beats becoming faster and faster. When the young man suddenly screamed, clenching his fists, he managed to move. The creature did not understand what was happening. It made him laugh. The blade began to make strange sounds. It seemed as if the air near his body was distorted. People were still in panic. They could not move, only groans were heard. Blade could not understand this, because he felt that every cell of his body seemed to be permeated with some kind of energy. Grabbing the bat, he looked at the monster in front of him, thinking that a fire was now happening in his body. He was overcome by an incomprehensible force. Suddenly, Jason jumped on the goblin's back and wrapped some kind of thread around its neck. The protagonist's hands were incredibly tense, squeezing the monster's neck tighter. Blade shouted to the boss. He was glad to see him. Jason, at that moment, continued to squeeze the creature's neck more and more. After the thread in the hands of our protagonist stretched to such an extent that it became like a razor, he jumped off it. Throwing the monster to the ground, Jason informed the goblin who greeted him that it could still move. The creature tried to resist. But suddenly the man changed his grip, pressing his back against the goblin's back and pushing him further down. Jason turned to Blade and asked him if he was still unconscious if he was actually holding a bat for show. The young man did not know how to answer the call of his companion. Suddenly, without realizing it, Blade ran up to the monster and dealt him a powerful blow. Blue blood spilled over several tens of meters around, and the sound of breaking bones was heard. There were dozens of people lying around, shelves were broken, and there was chaos everywhere. People set up shelter right in the store. They were afraid to go out because they didn't know what was waiting for them there. The human spirit was destroyed. They no longer knew how to live. Approaching them, Blade and Jason looked at them desperately, hoping that they would give them some hope for life. Blade couldn't believe that just 7 hours had changed his life so much. He couldn't believe that his previous problems were so harmless compared to his current ones. The young man looked at Jason. He was curious about his past. He understood that his past was difficult. There are only a few people left alive, and it's thanks to Jason. If it weren't for him, everyone would have died. Even I would have died, Blade thought. Blade evacuated the defenseless, and Jason himself killed these creatures. There was not a drop of confusion in his gaze, only confidence. Everyone panicked, but not our main character. He easily defended one department of the store after another, but to Jason, the situation seemed as absurd as possible. Looking at Blade, our main character asked him to take off his gloves. The boy could not believe what he saw, because a sign similar to a tattoo appeared on his hand. This power manifests itself in only 4, maybe 5% of people who are called awakened. The man, talking to the boy, told him that in their situation it was necessary to transmit information faster, so they would give this thing a simple name. Naturally, the young man agreed to this. Taking part of the goblin in his hand, the main character added that most likely this mark is somehow connected with these creatures, but he does not yet know how. He also added that some properties can be consulted by telephone. Jason ordered Blade to transfer all the goblin corpses to the meat department of the department store. The young man was dumbfounded by the order because he had never had to do this before. He was tired of corpses. The guy reasoned that he probably figured out why Jason needed the bodies in one place, because he was covered in blood, and in principle, generally speaking, he probably understood why he needed them. At this moment, the man experienced his new strength. He also shared the information he knew with others. Despite the panic, people believed the man standing in front of them because they considered him a hero who saved them. After all, if it weren't for him, most people would have died at the hands of monsters. Moreover, he recently taught a lesson to 3 attackers who tried to take advantage of the panic, and thanks to this, people began to trust him even more. Standing in front of the people, he wanted to share more information with them. When suddenly a woman in a white robe stood up and showed a sign. He was wondering what it was. Blade remembered that this woman was trying to resist those people who wanted to take advantage of the situation and cause even more panic. At that moment, Jason put on his hood and began to tell him that in order to survive, you need to think only about yourself. But he was going to talk about all the eels, and also added that there was no point in hiding information because the end of the world was approaching. He also released several crystals. The woman was interested in this and she asked the guys what crystals they were just talking about. The man, making a stern face, began to talk about crystals. After his story, many were shocked, because how could there be crystals in the bodies of monsters, and why do they need them? He also added that with the help of the phone, you can see the characteristics of both monsters and people, and crystals are needed to improve their own characteristics. He also added that they need to leave here. But the woman objected. The main character began to explain that this was just a temporary shelter. The monsters would soon arrive here again. But the woman objected that the situation outside could be much worse than now. But Jason, without letting the woman finish, said something like no one would come to save them, since no one had even tried to get in for 6 hours. And how could he say that the situation outside was worse than here if she wasn't there? There was. The main character stood in his position to leave this store as quickly as possible, but the woman continued to challenge this position. The woman began shouting that at that moment this place was safe, that not everyone would be able to move quickly, that there were children, old people, and wounded people in the store. Jason suddenly looked worriedly at the entrance. He shouted to everyone to move away from the entrance. No one understood why they should leave. Suddenly, it was as if there was an explosion. The entrance shattered into pieces. People fell to the ground. Blade and Jason immediately realized what was happening. The woman was in shock. A huge monster appeared from behind the broken body. It was larger than the previous one. The roar it made was much more terrifying than that of that huge goblin, and its mouth was larger. Jason said in despair that everyone should stay in their places. This creature is more dangerous, much more dangerous than the previous one. But in just a few moments, with just one blow, several people flew into the air, pouring blood all around. Blade's hand began to glow with a blue aura again. He gathered everything in his hand to attack the monster. Suddenly, the monster flew away, hitting its back against a concrete wall. He continued to push the monster against the wall with his increasingly strong force. But the energy took a lot of strength from Jason. He felt that his strength was gradually leaving him. He said that the monster appeared just in time because he wanted to test his new abilities. Everyone was surprised by the strength of our hero. They compared it to the power of a tank. The woman in the robe, without hesitation, said that she agreed that it was unsafe to stay here. There was a crack in the wall, the roar of crumbling concrete, and the monster's body began to tremble. The monster managed to touch the ground with its foot. It tried to push off, gathering all the strength in its legs. Jason's face was covered with sweat because the strength was leaving his body. He thought that he would easily break his neck, since it was very easy for him to bend the iron between his teeth. His comrades realized that this would not last long. Jason shouted to Blade to get everyone out of here. The guy didn't know what to do. While Blade remained in a stupor, the monster began to scream. There was a roar. The monster was able to move, thereby reflecting its compressed aura. The recoil knocked the man back a little, leaving his body weak. An ordinary person would not be able to stand, having lost so much strength, but Jason's body was hardened after numerous battles and training. Suddenly, there was a loud crunch of sneakers across the floor. Blade took the weight in his hand and ran with it towards the huge monster. He screamed. He wanted to kill this creature and protect his comrade. Approaching the huge monster, he hit it, and a roar was heard from the blow. The young man was happy because he hit the target. And suddenly, he heard Jason yelling at him to be careful. Blade noticed at that moment that the weight had broken, which surprised him. Turning around after his companion screamed, he saw that this giant was about to attack him. When he tried to block the blow, something in his hand creaked, and on his face you could see the pain that Blade experienced at the moment of the blow. The monster threw the guy several meters away with its colossal blow. The guy even turned around several times, groaning in pain. The survivors were shocked by the power of the giant. They did not know what to do because all hope was broken. Blade lay on the ground, spitting out blood, and his body was in great pain. At that moment, Jason ran up to the monster. He thought that he had miscalculated his capabilities a little, which is why he got tired so quickly. Approaching the monster, he tried to gather his energy in his hand again. But when he suddenly realized something, he was shocked. At that moment, the monster was also approaching our main character. Jason quickly stopped and then jumped slightly to the side. Gathering enough energy in his hand, Jason smiled as if he was enjoying fighting these creatures. Raising his hand into the air, he began to release his aura, his face turning sinister. The monster was a little dumbfounded, making some sounds. It looked at the man. The giant tried to rush at our hero, but he jumped further to the side. There was a roar. Huge clouds of dust rose. Fragments flew in different directions, raising even more dust. At this moment, Jason stood happily on the pipe. He managed to hold on to it with the help of his energy. His face was satisfied. There was a loud crash and the wall collapsed. Jason was a little cautious, and there was a little weakness in his eyes. Jumping up, he watched the actions of a huge creature that had just broken through a huge concrete wall with such ease. When he suddenly grabs a canister of fuel, at the moment of the battle, he could already look around and form a plan in his head. Opening the canister a little, he threw it straight at the monster, took out a lighter and lit it with a slight smile on his face. With his strong movement, he pointed the lighter directly towards the giant. An explosion occurred that directly hit the giant. The creature groaned in pain. Everyone was again stunned by what they saw, since they had already lost hope, when suddenly victory occurred. Jason immediately ran towards Blade, who was lying on the ground. She asked him if he was okay, to which he simply groaned and shook. The man asked the boy if he could move, to which the young man replied that he was in pain. Jason began to replay the situation in his head, because at first he did not understand how Blade recovered so quickly from such a strong blow. But suddenly, he realized that he himself could easily get up after the same blow. The woman asked the main character if everything was okay with him, if all the wounds healed so quickly. They realized that it was dangerous to be here, so they began to decide who would drive the car. Jason ordered everyone to leave and deal with the monster himself. They could not understand which monster because he won, but the look of our hero spoke for itself. Victory was still far away. The monster entered again with a roar. There were no significant wounds on its body. Screaming again, Jason told them to leave the department store as quickly as possible. People were scared again. Could the monster stay alive even after such a powerful explosion? They didn't understand this. The creature was right in front of them, smiling and still making a terrible roar. They all began to run away, leaving their hero with sadness on their faces. The sounds of people running echoed throughout the store as everyone tried to get out as quickly as possible. The only thing that was heard was requests not to push anyone and to run as quickly as possible. Blade and Ella ran forward. The young man had already recovered from the monster's attack. His wounds had healed. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the goblins burst in again, emitting Blade's now familiar squeals. But the guy did not lose heart and was not afraid, instantly attacking these vile creatures. Approaching the entrance, people began to rush in, breaking down the doors of the store. At this time, a battle was already underway between the giant and Jason. The main character dodged the creature's blows one after another. The monster's blows seemed much more powerful than before, but the man was not inferior to him, dodging all attempts to harm him. There was a roar from all sides when suddenly Jason was able to wound the monster. But all of our hero's weapons broke from just one touch. The man, looking at the giant, shouted at him to come closer and attack. The monster ran towards the hero. The people who came out were shocked by what was happening. No one could understand what happened and where they were, because it seemed that they were in a completely different city. They saw the house, what was happening around. The city was shrouded in darkness. There were roars and explosions throughout the city. Not a single lamp was lit. She looked around. Blade asked her what she was looking for, but she remained silent. When he suddenly ran up to the bus, the young man realized that he was looking for a vehicle for everyone. When suddenly a roar was heard out of nowhere, they saw a flying monster. The monster fell down and Jason fell on top of it, holding an almost broken knife in his hands. Grabbing the monster by the forearm, the main character tried to attack. An eerie sound was heard. It was the sound of a huge stone falling to the ground. The wreckage of the car scattered many meters around. Blade shouted to his boss in alarm. She looked frightened in the direction of his fall. Literally at the same time, Jason flew away. Jason uttered words of surprise and tried to stand up, blood flowing from his mouth. But the monster looked as if it had no injuries. It instantly rose to its feet, its skin as strong as steel. The main character shouted for them not to stay there, but to run away. Blade and Ella were shocked, their mouths hanging open. The man grabbed the pole, showing signs of laughter. Lifting the pillar from the ground, he raised it, waving it above him and signaling the monster to attack. Shouting to the monster to show him what he was made of, he ran towards it. The monster, roaring, also headed towards our hero. At that moment, a young man and woman ran up to the bus. Blade eagerly asked her if she knew how to drive a bus, to which she replied no. But with a smile on her face, she added that it was not much different from a car. The key was right on the dashboard. She grabbed it. They were a little surprised how lucky they were that the key was on the bus. At this time, a life and death battle raged between Jason and the giant. They dealt terrible blows to each other, dodged each other, and there was a battle of attrition between them. Second after second, a deafening roar was heard from their blows. No one could believe that this man was so strong because he fought such a big monster on equal terms. The monster roared, but the roar already seemed tired. Jason was glad the monster was still alive because the battle wasn't over yet. Pulling back the bat, they were about to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Suddenly, the sound of wheels approaching our hero was heard. The hero looked around, quickly looking to the side in surprise. Sweat did not stop flowing down his face. The monster looked at Jason, who continued to make an ominous roar. At this moment, Ella was driving the bus, screaming and pressing the gas pedal, directing the bus towards the monster. At the last moment, the monster turned around and saw a huge bus approaching him. Jason jumped to the side, and the giant turned towards the bus. Still roaring, he raised his hands and wanted to stop the bus. The main character slid along the ground, watching the collision. There was a noise. The bus crashed like a tank. The creature tried to stop the bus. The front of the bus was crushed, and the monster slid on the ground. As the creature tried to stop him, the sound of pieces of the bus breaking was heard. Blade shouted that Ella was pressing the gas pedal harder, to which she replied that she had already pressed the gas pedal all the way. When the giant suddenly felt that energy was gathering somewhere, he instantly turned to Jason. But it was too late. Jason had gathered enough energy in his hand. The main character stated that he understands that being hit by a bus will not kill him, but while he is busy stopping it, it can break his neck. When the monster's grip suddenly began to loosen, the blow hit the entire part of the monster. A deafening noise was heard, and the bus stopped on its front wheels. The guy screamed, squeezing the woman's neck. She screamed at Blade to loosen his grip because he might choke her. Jason, shouting to the giant to say hello to the devil, began to squeeze his neck. There was a crunch and a squeal from the monster. His neck was broken. The impact of the bus threw the monster against the wall, and a column of dust rose. People couldn't believe that they could actually kill him. The bus stopped, the wall broke, the roar of the engine died down. Everyone was delighted with what they saw. Jason continued to release energy, directing it towards the monster, releasing more and more. Sighing with relief, he stopped releasing energy, his eyes tired. Lowering his hand, the energy in his hand began to dissipate. The main character could not believe that for the first time in such a long time, he breathed a sigh of relief. He could not believe that he tried to commit suicide several times. But in this situation, having avoided death, he sighed a sigh of relief. He was happy. Looking at the ground, he thought that he was useless. His laughter was incomprehensible. When his gaze suddenly turned cold, he added that it wouldn't help. At that moment, Ella was lying on the bus, and Jason was on top of her. He asked the woman if this was normal. She looked worried. She told him that he was an idiot. He almost killed her twice. But the boy didn't listen to her. He was glad that she was safe. She was interested in what would happen to the monster if they won, but Blade was not interested. He was glad that she was safe and helped her up. The young man also helped her get off the bus, telling her everything if she was okay. When they got off the bus, they saw Jason standing over the monster's corpse, holding an axe in his hands. They screamed in surprise, not understanding what our hero was trying to do. Looking at him excitedly, they could not utter a word. They simply looked at his actions. Jason dealt blow after blow to the monster's body, cutting it into pieces, while blood flowed in different directions. Jason pulled the crystal out of his body and ate it. They couldn't say a word, they just watched as their comrades swallowed the stone. It seemed to her that after working as an intern for several years, she had seen a lot of things, and the smell of corpses was similar to Jason's. Adding that the man in front of her is a real evil demon, standing on the mountain of the dead and drowning in seas of blood. After some time, when everyone had moved away from the battle, they began to prepare to leave. Pack bags with everything you need to survive. Those around him followed his example and also began to collect the most necessary things. Jason pulled his hood over his head, threw his backpack on his back and looked around. Everyone was ready to hit the road. They went to the town hall. Fortunately for them, there were no monsters nearby. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, but the main character invited everyone to move forward. But this time, only those who woke up will be able to move forward with him. Everyone was surprised by Jason's words, because they understood that they could not survive without the awakened ones, and they cursed them. The trio left, leaving people in the town hall. Blade and Ella realized that the town hall had enough medicine, food, and weapons. They strengthened the gates with machines. Their chances of surviving there were much greater than moving forward with Jason. The people remaining in the city hall can become easy prey for monsters, because no one knows what awaits them next. They tried to convince themselves that they had made the right decision by leaving them there. Now they were moving to the military district. There was supposed to be a police station along the road. They wanted to take weapons there. Jason said that he would move on, let Ella and Blade follow him, but he would not relax and look around. He also added that any mistake they make could cause their death, so they should be careful. Entering the station, they saw mountains of corpses and the smell of blood hanging in the air. Jason, bending over to the first man lying on the ground, said that he died about 6 or 7 hours ago, and the cause of death was a bullet that passed through him. Our hero also ordered Blade to remove the corpses and block the doors as much as possible. She looked at the corpses of people. Jason looked around. The woman noticed one of the bags. It seemed somehow significant to her. Taking a cup from her bag, she showed it to her companions. Opening his phone, he pointed to the cup that gave him information about her. Jason read that this was the cup of God's healing. Blade was happy because it was something very important. The main character, looking at the young man, made it clear with just one glance that there was no need to shout. Holding the bowl, he began to absorb Ella's energy. The bowl began to fill with water. There was a splash and a sound was heard from inside. At first, no one understood how the cup was filled, other than filling it itself. It was also illuminated by a bright aura. They decided to check it out and started pouring water on Jason's wounds, when suddenly steam began to come out and the wounds began to heal. Blade shouted that his sister was now his healer. That was wonderful, Jason smiled. The man also added that the risks of using them are still high, since they consume a lot of energy, but are very useful. The man found several pistols and began to explain how to use them. The girl and boy were delighted with the find. They, of course, did not know whether they would be able to use it, but now they have a means of protection. As cold sweat suddenly started running down Jason's face, his teammates asked him what happened and why he was so tense. Suddenly, Jason's look changed. He became even more scared. The young man's gaze became even more frightened, and a trembling ran through his body. She and Blade fell to the ground, shaking, the strength seeming to leave their bodies. Jason ran to the door. When he opened the door, he felt some kind of horror. His face was covered in cold sweat again, but his expression did not change. He looked at the sky and saw something terrible there. Something was flying directly above him in the night sky. There was a loud scream of powerful blows that seemed to cut the air. It was a huge monster. It was much larger than the others. Its aura was stunning. Jason's body trembled slightly, because this was another fight with a powerful creature. His whole body tensed and his gaze became stern. It seemed that the main character was scared. But no, he was delighted with what he saw. He didn't understand where such strength came from, because he just flew past them. But his body was shaking. He felt danger. But at that moment he heard some sounds. Turning to his companions, he realized that not only his body was experiencing fear, The girl and boy lay on the ground, their bodies exhausted. She seemed to be in worse condition than Blade, so our protagonist ran to her first and began performing CPR. In addition to artificial respiration, he massaged her heart and squeezed her chest, but nothing helped. Listening to the heartbeat, he heard a slight beating, but there was no breathing. Then he remembered the healing cup. Grabbing it, he gave the liquid contained in the cup to his comrades to drink. They began to come to their senses, both coughing. The girl and boy could not understand why they suddenly began to drown. Jason said they were changing plans so they would rest here for a bit and then move on. It was still dark outside. A cold breeze was blowing, as if passing through the body. Time passed. Jason's companions were resting, but the man could not close his eyes for a second. He was immersed in his thoughts. The sun appeared. Darkness began to disappear on the streets of the city. Some time passed and the sounds of fighting were heard. Blade knocked down the goblins one by one, hitting them with his bat, the goblins flying in bunches. The boy was happy, because since the last battle he had become much stronger and learned to use his new strength. After dealing with everyone, he turned to Jason and asked what they would do next. Cutting down goblins for crystals, the man told his comrades to use their power correctly, for no one had yet mastered it perfectly, and any mistake could be paid. Throwing away the crystals, he added that if there were a more powerful being here, such weak goblins would not dare to be here. While eating the crystals, Ella said that's what they taste like. Jason added that they're getting out of here. It seemed to the girl that they had been wandering here for half an hour already, but it seemed that they were not avoiding monsters, but rather looking for them. At this moment, the man thought that such weak monsters need to be hunted. At this rate, they will slowly but surely accumulate strength. At that moment, shots were heard nearby. The military created huge barricades and opened fire on the monsters. The crowd of soldiers fired machine guns, and the deafening sound of numerous shots was heard. The goblins fell one after another from the bullets. There were a large number of them. They were countless. One after another they tried to break through the barricade. But they couldn't get through it. Along with the sounds of gunfire, the painful screams of monsters were also heard. The soldier was reloading the machine gun. He was the commander of the defense. He shouted to his comrades to hold the line of defense and not let anyone through. Suddenly a rumble was heard. A loud roar was heard. The small monsters turned around and a huge goblin appeared behind them. The soldiers were shocked by the size of the monster. When their commander suddenly shouted at them not to stop firing, shots were heard again. He also added that they took out grenades, and the bullets, one after another, pierced the body of the fat monster. Having taken out grenades and pulled out the pin, the soldiers, one after another, began to throw a huge thing in that direction. Explosions were heard one after another. The little goblins died one after another. One of the soldiers hit the monster directly in the head with a grenade, and an explosion occurred. A fire broke out on the creature's body. The heat seemed to burn the monster's body, but the flames began to subside, and its wounds instantly healed. The fat man breaks through the defenses, breaks the battle formation, and the military begins to retreat. Following the fat man, small monsters began to attack people, and people's screams were heard. The smell of blood rose into the air and red filled the ground. The commander shouted at them to move to the next line of defense. But the monster did not stop attacking people, killing soldiers one by one, when suddenly it found itself right next to its commander. But he managed to dodge the powerful blow, and the roar of breaking ground was heard. The monsters did not stop attacking. It seemed there would be no end to them. But the girl commander fought with the creatures that attacked her. Turning around and looking closer, the girl saw a large man approaching her. His body hesitated for a second. The trembling passed, and he realized that he had not had time to dodge. The monster's hand was trapped right in front of the soldier's face. She didn't understand what happened. Jason was nearby, who stopped the monster's blow. The military brigade did not understand what was happening, how to stop the advance of the monster. There was a crash behind Jason. He told the girl that he would leave if he wanted to live. At this moment, Blade had already attacked the monster, hitting it in the neck with a bat. He struck the monster in the face one blow after another, and terrible sounds were heard. Blade yelled at him to pay him for the numerous deaths. While shouting this, he continued to deal terrible blows to the monster. The girl lying on the ground could not believe her eyes, because the firepower of machine guns could not inflict wounds similar to those that he inflicts with an ordinary bat. Blade stopped attacking the monster. At that moment, Jason shouted that they were leaving. The young man grabbed the girl by the hand and began to run away. While running away, the girl asked the boy what he was doing, to which he replied that the boss would finish him off. Taking the canister and opening it slightly, he waved it. He threw the canister, followed by the lighter, right at this fat man. Continuing to hold him in place with her incredible strength, a fire broke out. The flames began to spread, followed by an explosion. Moments later, the creature's entire body burst into flames. Running back to Ella, the woman explained to the soldier that clay hardens when it meets fire. but the soldier did not understand what she meant. Jason's hand began to harden. This was his strengthening. The flames began to subside, and the monster showed signs of healing. The fat man chuckled but did not move. At this moment, Jason was already approaching him, waving his reinforced arm. There was a blow. It seemed so powerful that it could be compared to the onslaught of a tank. The creature's body began to fall apart into small pieces. Not only the military were surprised, but also Ella and Blade, because they saw Jason's new power. Elsa was surprised. She wondered more and more whether there was a person standing in front of her. Jason's arm was returning to normal and he was calm. The crumbling barricades in the city, which took so long to build, were destroyed in an instant. After a while, he saw Jason put some kind of crystal into his mouth. Replaying the moments in her head, Elsa thought that the monsters appeared yesterday. The trained officers were immediately killed by them. In addition, the connection was later interrupted and the enemy defeated the regiment's command. Fear of the enemy completely deprived him of his fighting spirit. He managed to gather the remnants of his troops and hold the line of defense. But he saw the death of the soldiers, after which he began to feel weak. And it was at that moment that he met Jason, who was so easily able to cope with what an entire army could not cope with. She looked at him with stunned eyes, seeing him as her hero. Jason turned to Elsa and asked if she was the commander, to which she replied yes. Jason added that they should prepare quickly because they need to get rid of the others. The main character also added that she will treat the wounded and Blade will help with defense. The lieutenant and the rest of the remaining soldiers had to cover them, but she shouted for our hero not to lead his horses or give orders because they did not know who he was. Without letting the girl finish, he added that there was most likely a commander inside, because the goblin attack was quite organized, and if everyone had not been killed now, the attacks would have been repeated. Without allowing the commander to object, he ordered them to begin preparations for the attack. Seeing his strength, the military regained their morale and followed their savior. They rushed to the attack. Everyone followed them without any alarm. The woman couldn't even resist him because the orders were clear and her goals were clear. Taking the machine gun in his hands, he showed excellent shooting skills. Hit the target and kill the creatures one by one. In addition to his shooting skills, he demonstrated high hand-to-hand combat skills. They never stopped advancing. Jason's orders were successful. Elsa couldn't even imagine how he had such high shooting and hand-to-hand combat skills, as well as organized orders. When suddenly a crash was heard, Jason managed to protect the commander's girlfriend. He immediately stood up and looked at the raised dust. A demon appeared behind her, holding what looked like a staff. The girl asked the man if it was a bomb, to which he replied in the negative. The demon's gaze was terrifying, and his roar made the body of an ordinary person tremble. Our main character realized that he had found who he was looking for. It was the commander of this group of monsters. The girl began to sweat. It seemed to her that her body could not even move now. Because the feeling of oppression and pressure was strong, she realized that the bullets of this creature had absolutely no meaning. Jason immediately gave the order to take aim and open fire on the leader, covering him. The demon screamed with a loud roar, raising his hand. Many monsters attacked. This was the demon's order to them. But Jason had already accumulated enough energy to attack with a knife. Elsa started shooting at the monster without letting go of the trigger, but he raised a kind of curtain right in front of him. The bullets did not hit him, but stopped right in front of him. She didn't understand what was happening, because how could the bullets freeze in the air? But Jason had already dealt with the entire crowd of monsters that rushed towards their leader. He threw the knife charged with his energy directly into the center of his staff. The knife flew with incredible speed. It seemed that the speed was comparable to the speed of a bullet. The monster's invisible field split. The staff broke, throwing the demon back. Following the knife, our protagonist approached the monster to kill the demon. The battle ended. All the enemies were destroyed. The military were able to regain their line of defense. There was silence. The shooting stopped and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Jason and Ella were helping the military. At that moment, Jason was resting on a bench and Elsa was carefully watching him. She thought that the man sitting in front of her was very strange. Approaching him, he seemed to be trying to say something, but could not speak first. Jason took the lead, telling her that she could ask anything, that this opportunity would never come again. The girl thanked him, but at the same time clarified how she knew his name. Our main character said that his grandfather was a brigadier general, and 5 years ago they met in the military district. Elsa began to remember those events, trying to remember Jason. Next to her were two generals. One of them was her grandfather, and next to the opposite general was a man. He suddenly remembered her cold face, which seemed creepy to him at that moment. The girl tried to ask her grandfather who they were, but his grandfather advised him not to ask about them anymore and try not to intersect with them, adding that their group has no divisions or ranks. They are like hungry wolves on the battlefield, killing everyone and everything. A small drop of sweat rolled down the girl's face. she realized that he was also a soldier. Elsa was surprised, because in front of her was a member of a special squad, which is a taboo for commanders in military districts. Jason walked up to Elsa. Our main character offered him a deal and asked him to gather all the soldiers. There was noise and running around in the building when suddenly they stopped. All the surviving soldiers of this barricade stood in front of Jason and his comrades. The man will suggest to them that anyone can join him and move on, or stay and defend the camp. Telling them that this disaster affected not only their city, but the entire country. Both places are not in the best conditions, and some are even much worse. All the soldiers were in their own thoughts, afraid to admit that they would have to fight these creatures again. Some began to lose faith in life. Jason, taking the bottle in his hand, made it fly with his strength, and then squeezed it, demonstrating his superiority. The girl reasoned that she was able to adapt to this new world. She had met creatures much more dangerous than the ones they had seen. She asked him what they would get in return if they joined him. Jason responded with a creepy look and informed everyone that thanks to him, their chances of survival would increase to the next level, and that the information he possessed would also be available to them. Sometime later, Jason got into the truck. There were soldiers in that truck, but their morale was depressed. Elsa reasoned that the information they gave her was useful, but it was not enough. She needed to learn much more. Blade gave them useful information. The girl thought that if it had been just a few days ago, she would have sent Blade to a mental hospital for such nonsense. Blade revealed that the patterns on their hands distinguished them from ordinary people, and that with the help of crystals they can level up. You can learn the characteristics of monsters through your phone by absorbing the crystals of strong monsters, which are shown to increase much more than if they were crystals of weak creatures. The Orc Crystal significantly increases knowledge of basic properties. Black Orc Crystal increases physical strength and skills, improves physical defense and strengthening skills. The Clay Monster Crystal increases skills, as well as physical defense and regeneration skills, and with the help of an upgrade, you can increase speed. Crystal of a Goblin Shaman increases supernatural powers, abilities, and magical stability. Seeing her strength, no one could resist Jason and the rest of the Awakened Ones. Elsa continued to reason. She was able to make a pill from various monsters. Using his phone, Jason checked the characteristics of the pill. Its characteristics were as follows. It slightly increases resistance to fear, recovery, concentration in battle, slightly reduces pain sensitivity, quickly depletes physical activity. Jason started talking about how even an ordinary group of trained people could handle weak monsters. But if there are superior monsters among them, then it will be difficult. Looking at the pill, he ordered that they try to make one for everyone to increase their chances of survival. She and Blade donned military uniforms. Blade asked Jason for permission to come up with a name for his team. Jason allowed him to take control with a smile on his face. Blade, gathering his courage, shouted that the name might be a bright path of morality hidden in the shadows, when suddenly someone from the shadows suggested simply M.O. M.O. translates as a mythical animal. He talked about himself. His name is Scott, but he is not awake, but really wants to help Jason. He also suggested that it would be worth going to the museum where the bows are kept. Jason saw him as an unusual person and asked who he used to be, to which he replied that he was an expert in smuggling, creating counterfeits and selling them. When Jason suddenly shouted an order that they would leave in half an hour, everyone should be wary. Scott compared Jason's cold, intimidating gaze to monsters, although his gaze scared him even more. Blade praised his commander and said that in just a few minutes he came up with such a perfect plan, and also found a truck that could not be afraid of small monsters. The guy did not close his mouth, trying to scatter and distract the rest of the soldiers. Blade, looking out the window, quietly said that he was interested in knowing whether anyone was worried about him or not. He remembered how cold Jake was to everyone, but thanks to absorbing the crystals, he felt much better together with our main character. Looking at Ella and Elsa, the boy added that he was afraid of becoming one of these monsters. Scott looked into the distance and felt uncomfortable. When suddenly there was an explosion, the soldiers panicked, asked what was happening, and looked out the windows. Everyone realized that fire could not start on its own, so they took out their weapons and began to take aim. Scott reasoned that buildings were full of people, so fires and secondary disasters were now quite normal. There was another explosion. Jason climbed out of the truck and slowly began to move towards the explosion. Stopping, he looked in the direction of the explosion, trying to see the cause. In an incomprehensible voice, he ordered everyone to take pills and prepare for battle. No one understood why their commander's voice changed so much. After ordering the others to wait for orders while Ella was present, he stepped forward, adding that Scott would come to fight him. The expert was shocked by this. The young man was shocked that he was sent into battle, but he did not yet understand what awaited him. In front of him were a large number of skeletons that looked like wolves. Jason told the guy to hold out for 3 minutes, fighting with those in the car. When he was asked why he would fight alone, there was suddenly a loud noise. A supreme monster appeared before them. Everyone trembled when they saw what they saw because he was bigger than the others, and his bloodlust could be felt even inside the truck. Suddenly, the monster howled, drawing out its claws. His howl created a strong wind that seemed about to knock Scott off his feet. The monster looked at the truck, growling. When shots suddenly rang out, Jason said he would take care of him. Many small creatures ran towards the military, emitting squeals. Jason fought side by side with Blade, throwing small creatures one after another, trying to get closer to their leader. When suddenly our main character grabbed a machine gun and started shooting. The supreme monster dodged the bullets. Jason was a little surprised by the monster's speed. Approaching the monster, he shot directly in the shoulder. The monster howled. While the creature remained in a stupor, the man struck it with his elbow. The leader tried to attack our hero, but he dodged. He compared it to previous monsters, although he added that he was probably stronger than them. They attacked each other, dodging the enemy's blows. Trying to attack the monster with a bayonet, Jason swung it, after which the monster tried to pierce him with its claws. The man, blocking the blow, began to attack the monster. Jason's scream was heard. Blue blood stole the protagonist's hand. There was silence. The sounds of gunfire and screams ceased, and a large number of corpses of monsters lay on the ground. The soldiers' faces seemed tired because the battle was difficult. Scott couldn't say a word. He was just thinking about how cool he was now. His commander stood right in front of him, holding the leader's head in his hands. Jason's features enlarged. Having decided who would stay and who would move to the museum, they headed towards the building. Scott and Ella went with the man. As they walked through the museum, they listened to every creak because they didn't know if there were any creatures in the building. Having found the bow and arrows, we checked through the phones. The name of the arrow was lost. Jason reasoned that weapons were most likely like people, that not everyone had abilities. But Scott tried to please his commander by telling him that he had something else that had special qualities. A friend told him that there was another treasure in the museum. While touring the museum, they heard Scott talk about how difficult his life had been. Suddenly she smiled, and from her smile everyone realized that they had found that same treasure. Looking at this, they could not look away for a second. It was a golden bowl. Its level was 3rd, and its value was special. With the help of this bowl, one could see the danger. They couldn't believe that some bush could predict the future. Suddenly, Elsa orders everyone to reload their weapons and move towards the truck. The entire crowd of soldiers ran towards the truck. Blade and Jason were already waiting outside the truck. Hearing the sounds of racing, the young man prepared for battle. The man next to him laughed and assured him that they were not monsters. A crowd of people approached them, darkness on their faces. Nobody understood what was happening, where so many people came from. Seeing the soldiers, people began to cry with joy because they felt saved. As we approached, we heard shouts of joy. Blade recognized one of the girls. He couldn't believe his eyes. Suddenly, Jason ordered to go to the museum because it was dangerous outside. No one could believe that such a large crowd of people could get there. People said that in the capital, some kind of flying monster was destroying the city. Fighter jets were blowing up bridges with missiles. Hearing this, Jason began to think that some other military base was still in operation. And judging by the distance, he guessed that it was the Air Force. But he still couldn't believe that the monster he had just fought had come from the capital. Having given the order that today they would relax in museums. But Jason did not intend to take any of the people with him. Elsa shouted that ordinary civilians should not be abandoned. Blade also screamed in disgust, trying to convince people that the Major was joking. People were panicking. They just felt safe, but the military wanted to abandon them. They started shouting that they were obliged to protect them, to which Jason clearly answered that this is not the military, but an organization of monster hunters. Their task is to kill monsters, not to save people. None of their subordinates are obliged to give their lives for them, adding that if anyone tries to stop them from moving forward, they will face death. All the military remembered the exploits of their elder, so no one wanted to confront him. After all, in addition to fighting monsters, he also taught them many things, for example, how to charge a phone from car batteries. The soldiers were calm because the commander's orders were always correct. The military understood that people would be in greater danger with them than if they had stayed here. Blade, Ella, and Elsa began to persuade their commander to take people with them. After thinking for a while, Jason said he would give them a chance. Sending an army to retrieve the monsters' corpses, Jason showed how to cut them up. Everyone except the children knocked out the monsters. 22 civilians passed the test. Suddenly, Scott came running with a full golden cup. The cup filled itself. Jason immediately realized what was happening. Taking the cup from Scott, the older man began to drink its contents. Suddenly, the man's body became heavy and he began to sweat. A second later, he fell to the ground, showing no signs of life. Everyone was frightened by what was happening. Everyone was screaming. The eldest was lying on the ground motionless. He found himself in a place unknown to him. Everything was on fire. I didn't understand why the body was moving on its own. After some time, he helped Blade leave, who asked him to leave. There were scars on the young man's face. The man did not understand why he asked him to leave. Pushing him towards the car, he ordered him to leave as quickly as possible. Blade shouted that Jason didn't need to sacrifice himself to save him. There was a crash and a column of dust rose up. Ordering Blade to leave, Jason grabbed his sword. Trying to persuade his commander to stay, the young man cried, but the man shouted that he would only get in the way. After starting the engine, Blade began to drive away, and our main character stood in a stupor, not understanding what kind of monster was in front of him. As he began channeling his power into his sword, he prepared for what could be his final battle. Suddenly, a huge monster appeared in front of him. Its size was impressive. Jason remembered that the creature flew over the border that night. Starting to scream, he ran towards the monster. When he suddenly opened his eyes, Scott, Ella, Lazy, and Blade appeared in front of him. Everyone began to ask him about his condition, but he remained silent. Standing up, he grabbed his head. His head seemed to be torn into pieces. She said the cause of his fainting was unknown, but his condition was absolutely good. When Jason suddenly said that he saw his death in a dream, everyone was shocked. He asked for coffee. His eyes were empty. Over coffee, he said that he didn't know who would survive, but it was obvious that he would die. He said that the great commander-in-chief, the commander of the 10th Motorized Rifle Regiment, is nearby. There is no front there, and they have enough firepower. He believes that they still exist. She assumed that some organization wanted to get rid of them. Scott added that it is necessary to collect the exposed pieces because they must not fall into the hands of enemies. Blade tried to console his commander by telling him that they now knew the future and could avoid death. Jason looked at the ground and thought about how to change the future. After some time, our heroes were already getting into the truck when suddenly a racing roar was heard. They saw huge monsters that looked like pigs and heard grunting. Jason ordered to wait for orders and conserve ammunition, called Blade, and added that they would be taken care of. The soldiers willingly followed the instructions of their commander. As Jason began to gather energy into his hand, he raised it. He directed his power towards the approaching crowd of creatures. The monsters fell to the ground squealing. Blade grabbed the bat, and our protagonist used the momentum of his hand. Having risen, the pig monsters began to move towards our heroes again. None of the common people understood what two people were trying to do against such powerful monsters. They wondered if they would die. Calmly approaching them, the boys smiled. The girl screamed Blade's name and told him to run, and suddenly Blade swung his bat straight at the monster. At this time, Jason had already killed several creatures. Everyone was surprised that ordinary people fought and defeated monsters. Blow after blow, Blade killed the creatures. Jason, killing, moved through the crowd, scattering it in different directions. After some time, a large crowd of monsters gathered around them. Jason breathed a sigh of relief and said it was easy. Even the military was shocked by the power of Blade and Jason. They believed that they were much more dangerous than these monsters, and they were lucky to have them on their side. When they got out of the truck, they approached some pigs the size of bulls and did not understand how they could be moved. Jason ordered them to return to camp to get weapons and clothing and to repair the car. Everyone was busy working and shouts of joy could be heard. I felt the cold outside. The wind was blowing, when suddenly I heard the sounds of an engine. Everyone was on alert, pointed to the car, and the commander got out of it. With him was a girl in military uniform. Blade said it was a nurse. They found her in the city while on patrol. They saw a severed head, but the cut was made by something sharp and clean. They also discovered another organization called Miami. Its leader's name is Maya. No one could believe that they were sacrificing people to monsters in order to survive. Everyone began to discuss this story, when suddenly Jason interrupted them. He said that he wanted to go with them, but they interrupted him, saying that he would not go alone, that they would go with him. Jason added that they were afraid that they would just have to kill their leader and be done with it. He also said that they shouldn't fight the entire group and that he doesn't know their strength either. After some time of silence, he said that he was good at killing secretly. No one understood the words of his commander. Before the elder left, Ella asked him to return alive. It was snowing and it was starting to feel like winter outside. A crowd of people had gathered inside the building, discussing the arrival of cold weather. As they sat, they discussed that Squad B had gone to deal with the creature that was trying to escape. From their conversations, it was clear that their scout had not returned. Jason stood with his mask and hood up and looked at the building. There was a large crowd of people behind him. He had to cope in an hour. There was a knock on the door. Members of Mamie's group thought it was a scout troop. Suddenly, a truck burst through the door, scattering a crowd of people in different directions. Screams began to be heard that a stranger had attacked them. The truck did not stop, but continued to accelerate. Suddenly, the door opened and a masked man jumped out. No one could understand where such a madman had come from. The truck crashed into the wall and a roar was heard. When they approached the truck, they saw that no one was inside. They ran to look for whoever was driving the truck. Suddenly, a masked man appeared, put a knife to his throat, and asked him to drop the weapon. It was our main character, Jason. He was trying to understand what kind of yellow-eyed demon he was to them. He also said that only the leader managed to survive the meeting with him, after which they regularly sacrifice people. The man from the Miami gang tried to appease Jason with the idea that he could spend the whole night with any girl and that they would also help him deal with him. Jason cut his own throat and said something to the effect that he didn't want a man who would betray his commander. The corpse of this man was lying on the ground covered in blood. Most likely he was not lying, our hero thought. He put on his mask and began to move forward. A crowd of people lay on the ground, covered in blood. There were sounds of growls, pitiful moans, sounds of screams, and the remaining members attacked Jason. A battle began between them, and our main character was attacked by a large crowd of people. While fighting one of them, someone attacked Jason from behind. With a quick movement of his hands, Jason cut his attacker's throat. Another man attacked him from behind, but our protagonist, with a quick movement of his hands, stabbed him with a knife. He killed the attackers one by one, demonstrating his superiority in the use of bladed weapons. The attackers fell before him one after another, shedding rivers of blood. He left behind mountains of corpses, all of them dead. Having walked a little further, he was surprised by the silence that alarmed our hero. He felt danger but could not understand where it came from. When he suddenly felt the heat, he quickly looked around and saw something incomprehensible. 2 fireballs flew towards him at great speed. Having managed to avoid this, a strong explosion was heard, and the fire engulfed a large area. He grabbed the holstered pistol hanging from his belt and removed the safety. Immediately aiming in the direction from which the bullets flew, he opened fire. He shot at a man in iron armor. The bullets seemed to bounce off him. Jason was surprised that after firing a full magazine, the man in front of him was still standing, with only small drops of blood running down him. Having reloaded the pistol, the main character continued shooting at the man in armor, but he jumped back and hid behind the wall, after which he drank some liquid and breathed out flames directly towards our hero. Jason was thrown back, but was able to regroup and get to his feet, continuing to fire at his attacker. The masked man was still hiding behind the wall of bullets, trying to catch his breath. While reloading his gun, Jason started screaming, trying to say something to our main character. Our main character listened and heard him ask if he was a primitive hunter. He also said that he thought that he was the only survivor in this city. But this is not the case, and he will have fun not only with monsters, but also with elite warriors. He told her about the powerful monsters he fought. The main character heard this story, wondering who he would now have to fight and where he got so much power from. Jason wondered why he needed a monster and where he got this armor. Only a black monster with such a powerful skin came to mind. The masked man asked Jason why he attacked them, and after a while also asked if he was really against his organization's actions. At this moment, a group of people had already gathered below, preparing to defend their commander, discussing the fact that there was only one attacker and that they could easily kill him in the middle of the crowd. They shouted that the future was in their hands and that they could rebuild the city and live in joy. They shouted that they would create a hunting organization and rushed into battle with great enthusiasm. The masked man was glad that help came so quickly. Jason was not embarrassed by their number, because the more opponents, the more panic can be created, and our main character is used to fighting several opponents instead of one. The crowd shouted that they would now surround our main character and kill him. It would be easy for them, they thought. Having run behind the pillar, they saw no one, began to panic and shout that he was not there. When suddenly a noise was heard above them, they looked up to see Jason already aiming at them. They were shocked and scared. Screams could be heard throughout the shopping center. When Jason encountered a crowd of people, a masked man tried to attack him. He shouted that he deliberately let them attack as a distraction, and after a few seconds he added that he died faster. Swinging the sword, a crash was heard. An entire shelf with some documents was cut off with one blow, and the wind raised the swing. With his strength, he even cut down his own subordinates who were on the other side of the regiment. Screams were heard. Standing around a large number of human corpses, he anxiously asked where he was. He was frightened when suddenly words came from behind him that he was not worthy to carry such a strong sword with him. Our main character immediately after his words began to inflict a large number of powerful blows on the masked man. The blows were so fast that I couldn't even see them. Suddenly, without realizing it, he found himself face down in the air. Jason threw the commander headlong. There was a roar and groans of pain. Our main character held a sword in his hands and was surrounded by mountains of corpses, leaving devastation in his wake. The masked man lay down on the ground and asked where he got so much power. But our main character looked at him silently. He began to beg our hero for mercy, saying that if he joined him, he would receive a high status in his group, as well as a yellow-eyed demon. But our protagonist simply sighed. He repeated this again in a whisper in a trembling voice, saying that he begged her to have mercy and not kill him. But our main character answered in a cold voice that he refused. Spatters of blood spread out to the sides, even reaching the ceiling. Thanks to the victory over this group, our hero received the general's dagger, as well as firewater. Strange screams were heard in the streets. Our heroes stood in front of the masked man's subordinates and said that the awakened ones should become their dogs, and also give them a quarter of the crystals they received. But they shouted in response that they did not agree to become his subordinates and that they still served their commander Mayum. But Scott stood up and told those who didn't seem to understand the situation they were in to get angry. They told him that they had woken up, that he was an ordinary person, and that he should not look down on them. Suddenly, Jason released an arrow. It flew straight into the eye of the awakened former Yakuza deputy. He fell to the ground. Everyone who screamed was scared by this. Taking their hand and releasing the energy, Jason said that he wanted to skin them, but decided to lament that from now on, if they dared to kill a person or show any type of violence, they would be finished. They immediately agreed. They were also surprised by the strength of our main character. Jason quickly grabbed the arrow with his hands, showing his superiority. Having hidden the arrow, he added that now he would be informed about everything every 3 days. They immediately agreed. After a while, he told everyone to leave, and Scott stood there covered in sweat. This afternoon, there was silence on the street. A cool breeze was blowing. It was late autumn outside. Jason, standing in front of his subordinates, said that in a few days they would go hunting for the yellow-eyed demon. Everyone listened to him attentively. He showed images of this creature. Everyone was surprised by the power of this demon. In the video, he destroyed entire buildings with such ease that it was impossible to believe. They said that they didn't even have a chance. They were all shocked by the power of this demon. But their commander told them that if they want to survive, they will have to take risks. Everyone was surprised. They could not even find the words to start arguing with our main character. He also added that this time he would not go hunting alone. A few days later, they held a meeting in the building. They talked about how several days later they sacrificed several people to this demon. Jason ordered them to gather all the people who were going to hunt. She had to gather doctors to help the wounded. Holding the divine cup in his hands, he said that it would only be used specifically for the wounded. Jason and a squad of stormtroopers will clear the main area of monsters. There was an offensive of monsters. The defenders of the territory began to retreat. But then Blade appeared and began to destroy one monster after another. With his strength, he killed monsters with one blow, delivering crushing blows with a bat. Elsa used her rifle to hit the monsters with precision, destroying them one by one. In addition to shooting, he also demonstrated the use of a bayonet in close combat. Everyone rejoiced, saying that these two no longer even look like people. Their strength is incredibly enormous. At that moment, the screams of monsters were heard nearby. Jason had to cleanse the blood of monsters, and a large crowd of monsters gathered around him. Checking his statistics, he saw a significant increase in his strength. His strength had already reached level 100, and his physical fitness had reached 89. When he climbed to the roof, he noticed that there was a dead silence there, which could only portend trouble. Suddenly, our hero screamed at the top of his lungs. The monster woke up, opened its eyes, and darkness rose into the air. The rumble and crunch of asphalt began to be heard from under the ground, and the earth began to collapse. The cars began to rise into the air like small pebbles. A yellow-eyed demon appeared from the ground. He was huge. Our main character appeared before him, ready for battle. Jason said it looked like a nasty snake. The yellow-eyed demon was screaming, making creepy sounds. Compared to Jason, he was huge and attacked our main character. But he quickly raised his gun and began shooting at the demon. The demon continued to approach our hero, showing his superiority in strength. As soon as our hero realized that the bullets did not hit him, he turned around and ran in the opposite direction. He ran away from the yellow-eyed demon, but it caught up with him, his speed exceeding the speed of a person. Screaming, he destroyed everything in his path, but our main character, smiling, told him to do the right thing and follow him. Jason used every means to slow the creature down, jumping over cars in the hope that its speed would be significantly reduced. But the monster didn't even notice any obstacles and moved at the same speed as on a flat road. The yellow-eyed demon approached our main character significantly. He was ready to grab him. Jason thought he needed to put in some effort because he would be arriving soon. Behind him, the demon left destruction, and a deafening roar could be heard wherever he moved. At this time, the stormtroopers were on the roof, holding role-playing games in their hands. Everyone was surprised by the size of this colossus, because in the video it seemed much smaller than it actually is. Everyone kept saying that he was much scarier than in the video, and sweat was running down their faces. Jason, drawing a dagger, told the yellow-eyed demon that this place would become his grave. The stormtroopers held anti-tank grenade launchers in their hands. Their accuracy should definitely have been enough to eliminate this monster. Jason talked about how he had to lead the monster into a trap, and the stormtroopers would open fire on it. The main character said that this does not require many people. 10 experienced grenade launchers are enough. He also added that he would use magic to delay him while the stormtroopers attacked, and then finish everything himself. He said that if their plan failed, they would forget about it and retreat immediately. The monster attacked our hero, preparing to eat him. But our hero was not afraid and immediately began to use magic to try to stop him. The yellow-eyed demon made terrible screams as it tried to eat our protagonist. Jason said out loud that this monster was simply amazing because there was such a strong pressure coming from it, and also added that it would be very difficult for him to resist even for a second. But then Elsa ordered to shoot. Everyone was waiting for this order with fear. 10 stormtroopers immediately opened fire on the monster. All the shots hit the target, and explosions began to be heard from the impacts. Within seconds, the entire yellow-eyed demon was engulfed in flames. There was a strong roar of flames, and the squeals of the monster were heard. Our main character looked at the flames with fear, waiting to see if his idea had come to fruition. Blade stood up and said that he did not expect such power from these grenade launchers. But as soon as the flames died down, the yellow-eyed demon was completely unharmed. But everyone felt his anger. But suddenly blood flowed from his head, but the charge managed to wound the monster. Everyone was surprised that he remained alive after such an attack. No one could believe it. And at that moment, the evil demon was already approaching the stormtroopers. But our main character was already running towards him to attack. As soon as he approached the monster, he immediately attacked it with his dagger. Everyone looked in amazement. No one could even imagine what would happen next. Jason stood up and looked at the monster, wiping the sweat. He said that the wound was superficial, but it could still hurt him, that is, kill him. But the monster immediately attacked him. Jason barely had time to dodge it. The yellow-eyed demon continued to launch attack after attack, but our protagonist dodged each of the monster's attacks. The monster got angry, he shouted at our main character, showing his anger. Jason, thinking he would have to sing anyway, jumped into action. While trying to attack the monster, he noticed some strange movements of the monster. When he was suddenly hit by the monster's tail, the blow went straight to the man. Jason was thrown back several times. The blow was powerful. Our hero was lying on the ground. He couldn't even move. Everyone started screaming in alarm. The monster was still angry and was preparing to attack our hero again. He let out angry screams and then ran towards our hero. Jason lay on the ground and couldn't even move. Everyone looked at what was happening with alarm. They couldn't even move out of fear because the monster was putting enormous pressure on them. Jason tried to get up, but the monster was already approaching him. As soon as the man stood up, the yellow-eyed demon was already right in front of him. The hero was covered in blood, thinking that he would not have time to dodge, but he could not give up so easily. Scott and Elsa continued to anxiously shout Jason's name and ask him to run as quickly as possible. Our main character fell straight into the snake's mouth. There was a crushing roar. Thick dust rose and everyone was stunned. Blade tried to run towards the yellow-eyed demon, but was stopped by Elsa. He shouted at her to let him go, but she responded by telling him to remember the order the Major had given him. He also added that if they continued to fight him, they would all die, and the commander ordered them to survive. But the demon still could not stop and calm down. He destroyed everything in his path. Elsa shouted that everyone was leaving and that she would cover for them. When Jason suddenly opened his eyes, he wondered if he had survived. At that moment, the yellow-eyed one tried to eat Elsa, but she jumped and was able to dodge the demon's attack. Jason thought he couldn't even move. He wondered how the others were doing since they had angered the demon so much. Everyone shot at the demon, shouted that they needed to retreat. Panic began to appear in their ranks. Our main character lay and felt sounds similar to a heartbeat. It lay right next to the yellow-eyed demon's heart. He looked at him in surprise, thinking that he was incredibly lucky. Jason laughed and said that the demon would regret swallowing him. He extended his hand and began to release magic. At this time, the demon had already destroyed almost the entire city. The fighters were lying on the ground. The demon was preparing to eat them. He screamed, making terrible sounds. Everyone thought that everyone would die. The yellow-eyed demon ran towards our heroes, who were tremblingly preparing to accept the monster's attack. At this moment, inside the monster, our main character squeezed the snake's heart with all his strength. Suddenly, there was a crash and blue blood gushed out. The demon stopped right in front of our heroes and stopped making any sounds. Blood flowed from the mouth. No one understood what happened. Suddenly, the demon began to wreak havoc, spitting out blood. They felt as if the demon was being torn apart from the inside. She started screaming. Everyone was watching. No one could even imagine what was happening to her. Elsa said that they were lucky, and this was their chance to escape. And suddenly, the yellow-eyed demon spat on Jason. The snake was still screaming from the pain that struck him from the inside. Jason lay on the ground, bleeding. His whole body was wounded. Blade stood up and asked what was going on. Jason thought his heart wasn't completely broken yet. He needed to be killed as quickly as possible while he was panicking. The soldiers ran to him. They were glad that their elder was alive. They surrounded him and began to ask how he could survive. But Jason immediately interrupted them, saying that they had disobeyed orders. Having stood up and wiped off the blood, after a while he added that thank God they didn't leave. Now they would surround him and kill him. There was noise and screams in the streets. They all surrounded the monster, started shooting at it and throwing grenades at it. The monster began to scream even louder, his anger consuming the air and feeling cold. The snake ran towards the attackers. They all started to run. At this moment, our main character was already approaching him. He was also angry. He wanted to crush the huge demon with one blow. He climbed higher and higher along the huge body of the snake. Climbing as high as possible, he pulled out a dagger and jumped, trying to hit the monster right in the head. He shouted at him to die as quickly as possible. The demon understood that he would not have time to dodge the attack. Jason attacked the monster with crushing force, aiming the dagger straight at its head. Now the cry of the yellow-eyed demon was not scary. He was screaming in pain. The blood began to splash in different directions, covering everything in a blue-green color. Jason smiled and told the demon not to move and to die as quickly as possible. The snake tried to pull our protagonist out of his head, but he did not let go of the dagger, trying to drive it even deeper. The monster crashed headfirst into the building, destroying it. Jason began to lose a large amount of blood, and his whole body began to hurt. Suddenly, the scream stopped and the demon froze in one place. The yellow-eyed demon fell to the ground and a loud crash was heard. Nobody could believe in victory. There was silence. When Jason suddenly appeared, everyone started screaming for victory. Their commander was able to win. The main character, with the last of his strength, moved towards his comrades. He sighed with relief and a smile appeared on his face. Blade and Elsa were still surprised. They couldn't believe they had won. They ran up to Jason, who could barely stand, and began to shout with joy. Blade screamed that he couldn't believe he could defeat such a powerful demon. After some time, all the flames went out and there was silence. Our heroes found themselves right next to the snake. The creature was covered in blood. It was dead. Jason brandished the dagger, signs of disgust visible on his face. Blood spilled in all directions, turning blue for the next few meters. No one could say a word. No one really came to their senses after the fight. Jason was holding a magical black snake crystal in his hands. He put it in his mouth and then swallowed it. His wounds immediately began to heal. Steam came out of them, and the wounds healed. And his left eye took on an animal appearance, and all his features increased in level. Everyone stood up and looked at Jason's changes in surprise. They headed towards their camp and heard the loud roar of an engine. The soldiers remaining in the camp rejoiced at the return of their commanders, and also rejoiced at their victory. They shouted the name of their commander, saying that he was the best. Everyone was happy except Jason, who was looking at the ground. Scott expressed joy at the major's instructions. Elsa also congratulated our main character on his victory. Jason walked, still lost in thought. Sometime later, everyone was having dinner, continuing to discuss the great victory. Some of them were happy with the cola because they had not drunk it for a long time. The main army was moved to the municipal center. There was no need to be outside when they were not in danger of death. This place was close to the market, and large warehouses rich in goods. The priest of the Black Death was moved with the help of bulldozers and heavy equipment. He remembered the times when the soldiers died in the war against the Black Plague. The priest of the Black Death played an important role in the production of protective equipment. Scott, looking at the snake, said that even when it was dead, its skin was like steel. Elsa said that they dismembered him and did not find the stone. Now they are no different from ordinary killers. Scott said there is talk of building a workshop around it. He also added that he needs to find someone. His nickname is Keith. He said that when it comes to theft of cultural or commercial property, there is no one better than him. He is a professional in his field. Jason asked him where the whale was. Scott showed the man's location on a map, but added that it wouldn't be easy. She said that this place where people gather means that there are many monsters there. They have no pills left, and the fighters have not rested for a long time. Jason, not allowing Scott to finish, ordered everyone to pack up and leave immediately. Elsa tried to argue with the commander, saying that they did not know what was there, but Jason told her that with the help of his new power, he sensed that there would be no strong monsters there. The main character also added that they don't need many people, only some Scott and Blade will go with him. He ordered them to take the cartridges and tablets and wait for him. Elsa had to take care of the corpses, and Ella the wounded. They looked at the commander in surprise, not quite understanding what was on his mind, but they trusted him and agreed to carry out his order. After some time, they were traveling in a van. The battle with the Black Death was the most terrible. From preparation to battle, they miraculously survived. Circumstances indicate that the monster's strength can be determined by the color of its eyes. They resemble the colors of the rainbow, and each color is much stronger than the previous one, Jason thought. He also thought that the monster he saw might not be the strongest. After 2 hours of travel, they arrived at this settlement. There was a loud roar of hooves that seemed to destroy the ground below them. Some strange creatures, similar to pigs and elephants, were running around and making deafening sounds. Jason immediately sprang into action and jumped out of the truck. Blade and Scott were scared because this crowd of huge monsters was heading straight towards the head of the van. Jason's eyes took on an animalistic look, reminiscent of a snake. He immediately rushed to fight the monsters. He swung his dagger, scattering monsters in different directions. The monsters continued to appear, each one seeming larger than the last. But Jason did not retreat, but only advanced further, showing his superiority over them. The monsters also did not intend to retreat. They wanted to crush the arrogant man who dared to engage them in battle. But his strength was nothing compared to the strength of our protagonist, who destroyed several monsters at once with just one movement of his dagger. Piteous cries were heard. The cries of monsters suffering from pain could be heard for many miles around. Jason and Scott watched with shock and sweat on their faces as Jason made his way through the large crowd of monsters with such ease. Our hero's face was stern. It seemed as if some creature had infused him with power. An hour later, there was silence. All screams stopped. Our heroes stood around a crowd of killed monsters. They entered the building Scott was talking about. When you entered this building, you could hear Blade's delight. He said that it was still true. Scott said he heard that the whale takes whatever it wants, but he didn't know he collected that much. Blade just said it was some kind of museum. Scott said there was so much here that his eyes were running wild, and he needed to take pictures of it all. Jason touched the wall, saying that there was nothing useful here. Blade asked him what it was, when suddenly our main character turned around. There was a rumble and a little dust rose. Scott and Blade tried to figure out what Jason saw there and why he destroyed the wall. The dust cleared, and in front of Jason was a huge hole in the wall, and behind him a huge room. The room was full of valuables. It was a secret room. Scott couldn't believe his eyes. Jason told Scott it was great because there was some really valuable stuff in there. He told her that everything was being taken from this room and the rest was garbage. There was a beauty blessing scroll in the room, as well as a tall birth chart. Blade was still surprised by the find. He told his commander that these two things were very valuable. Scott couldn't believe his eyes because he didn't expect to find something like this. A few hours later, they returned to their domain. They all stood up and also joyfully greeted their commander. Elsa praised Blade, and Ella asked him about his successes, and he, in turn, boasted about his discoveries. He pointed to the van and said that all these things were very valuable. Everyone stood up and unloaded the van. No one could stop cheering as Elsa stood up and talked about how happy she was to join Jason. Scott had two important finds in his hands depicting Ella and Elsa. Scott was talking about having a core map in his hands. Elsa couldn't believe her eyes. They were discussing how this map works. The brighter the color, the more monsters there are in that place. This map is something like a radar. Jason also added that the closer you look, the less they will see, but the further you go, the stronger you become, and also asked Scott what the highest score of monsters identified so far is. They said that if the expected color classification is confirmed, blue lights will appear. Blade said that the world is full of monsters stronger than the Black Plague. Elsa couldn't believe it. Jason thought that with his current strength, he would not be able to stand up to stronger monsters. People heard rumors about the chief and began to gather and move towards them, creating the McClan. No one was able to cope. Instead, the chief allowed McClan to expand into McGuild and create a new clan under his protection. They all stood up and said that they had been standing for several hours and were waiting for their commander. Soon after the boss appeared, many calmed down. They were repressed only by a small part of the major. Jason took their weapons and said that negotiations would begin immediately. The boss had already become an independent representative of the entire city. He could no longer simply unconditionally please the people. Jason said that some of them will receive gadgets, all of them will receive weapons and ammunition. He also added that the awakened ones and the team members would enter McClan and start working. Everyone began to rejoice. The people applauded, but it was not easy to fulfill the boss's demands. Jason said there weren't enough artifacts, so one of the conditions was a hand. Nobody understood what was happening, in the sense that everyone was thinking with one hand. Of course, this was a test of how we could decide to sacrifice you. No one doubted it. Some thought that Jason would seriously cut off their hand. Soon, anger and confusion gave way to fear. If a challenger scored more than 9 points, they were eliminated, leaving only 2 challengers. The woman and the man shouted their demands in unison. Jason, just in case, asked the people again which of them wanted to get weapons. He threw the dagger straight at the girl and the man. A multi-axis scream was heard. The dagger stabbed into the ground with incredible force, after which he returned to Jason's hand, and he in turn said that they should keep his hand in reserve. If they break or do not follow the rules, they will return without question. Jason told Scott that these two will join his equipment. The girl and the man could not gather their thoughts. They were simply ready to say goodbye to his hand. Some time passed, night came. Jason asked Robert if he had chosen a weapon. Scott thought that these two were very well prepared and would be able to get used to everything quickly. Jason asked Scott when the protective gear would be ready, to which he replied that the shop manager said he could finish the prototype today. He also added that if the major approves it, mass production will begin from today. They moved into the workshop when suddenly Elsa screamed. Approaching the map, Elsa said that the green dot had moved. Jason said that he had not encountered such monsters yet, so he could not say for sure, but it was clear to him that with his current abilities, fighting green-eyed monsters was simply impossible. In addition, monsters with orange eyes were approaching the city. Scott said he thought there would be some respite, but it turned out to be the calm before the storm. But after some time, Jason thoughtfully told them that their only chance to get a green rating was now, and also added that there was no time, they must continue to fight and supply at the same time in order to increase their chances of survival. Everyone stood up and listened to Jason's order. Everyone understood that there was only enough ammunition for this battle. 2 more units were heading towards another city. Weapons had to be transported there, Jason said. Robert and Eve agreed to carry out Jason's orders. The major also added that there is no information about the 4th rating, that is green-eyed, but now there is a high probability of destroying our squad. After increasing the rating, they must solve it as quickly as possible. Blade and Scott stood there sweating. They were a little scared because the last battle was difficult. Jason entered the workshop. Suddenly, the man shouted that they were here. The old man barely stood up and shouted for his things to be prepared. Redval and his team approached Jason. Scott introduced the major, who in turn bowed and said he was glad to meet him. The workshop manager, looking at Jason, was speechless for a moment. Jason politely turned to Redwall and asked to show him his prototype equipment, which in turn showed them where they should go next. They entered the workshop, where there were a lot of things. It was immediately clear that they had spent a lot of time here. Uniforms were lying on the table. Everyone shouted wow in surprise. Jason looked at the form. At this time, Redval said that about 20 forms were already ready. With their current production speed, they can produce 10 molds per day. The shop manager also showed the weapon. Jason thanked him, because now they can fight with oranges. Eyes of Black Death when swallowed give the power of Black Death. Swords increase power. Everyone was surprised, because no one could believe that artifacts could be created with your own hands. Jason was still in his thoughts, saying that they were leaving. That's how accurate Eve answered. They said goodbye to the owner and his subordinates. Radval wished Jason and his team good luck as they left. Redwall thought he knew why he was praising him and following him. An hour passed and everyone was preparing for battle. Elsa and Blade were guarding the entrance to the room. In this room, Jason sat on a chair and slept soundly. Next to him stood an empty divine cup. He opened his eyes to the screams calling out to him. Opening his eyes, he wondered whose voice it was. Opening his eyes, he asked Ella if it was her and why she let her hair grow. She was sobbing and couldn't stop screaming his name. Jason thought he didn't understand how much time had passed, but his body was very cold. He knew he was dying. When he suddenly closed his eyes, Ella screamed even louder. The girl screamed at Jason to remember that he could change this. She hoped that he would help her and express her desire. The boy, who opened his eyes slightly, did not understand what was happening. Suddenly, he woke up covered in sweat. Holding his head, he thought that such a future was unacceptable. Leaving the room, he ordered everyone to gather together. After a while, everyone gathered around and discussed the future that Jason saw. Jason explained the 6 artifacts Ella mentioned. Scott started talking about some strange museum that might have artifacts, but our protagonist informed him that these artifacts were most likely already stolen. But Scott said there was still a chance and they should check it out. He spoke of a great tomb. But suddenly Scott screamed and grabbed his head. He shouted that he was wondering who could offend the boss like that. Jason thought that if he were a monster, he would not have left him alive. She also did not participate in the battle, and he died of weakness. Blade compared the current world to a video game. Our hero suggested that the number of monsters may be limited. He said that in the end, it might turn out that there will be more people and fewer monsters, then people will rise to the top again. Everyone listened carefully to our protagonist's suggestions. The roar of engines is heard. Our heroes were heading somewhere. Eva and Robert remained silent, because this was their first time participating in the mission. They traveled with new equipment. The equipment covered the entire body, was comfortable to wear, and had freedom of movement. Everyone was talking about collecting as many of the remaining weapons and pills as possible. Everyone thought that the monsters surrounding the town hall had not been identified. They needed to defend themselves and monitor them with a minimum number of people. Blade said that Eve and Robert would split into two teams. Blade and Elsa had to use the map to find their location and then get rid of the weak monsters, while Scott and Ella remained in the mayor's office to guard the base and monitor the wounded, as well as periodically report on the situation on the map. Jason also added that after completing their missions, they returned to their unit. As he left, he told them that they would return alive. There was silence. Everyone looked at our main character, seeing in him their commander. As soon as Jason started to leave, they shouted in unison that it was time to eat. There were shouts in the streets, and there was a slight pressure in the air. A large number of monsters were moving somewhere, and human corpses were lying around. The monsters destroyed absolutely everything in their path. Along the way, they ate the remains of the survivors. A larger lizard-like monster was moving behind them. Among them was a huge monster, which stood out primarily for its size. The monsters made sounds similar to the cawing of crows. The orange-eyed demon looked into the distance. A crowd of monsters surrounded our main character, who was standing on the skull of some monster. Jason wondered how many of them had come, but this was their territory. He laughed and said they would regret going anywhere near his territory. This skull belonged to the Black Death. They deliberately blocked the entrance. Raising his hand, he ordered everyone to get ready. Everyone was ready. No one wanted to lose their place. The monsters outnumbered the humans many times over, but no one showed any fear. And suddenly, Jason shouted at them to leave. A loud sound was heard, and at the same time, several soldiers removed the pin from the grenade. The soldiers began throwing grenades directly into the crowd of monsters. The monsters did not immediately understand what was happening. Suddenly, grenades began to explode and flames rose. This was followed by shots fired and a strong smell of gunpowder in the air. The monsters screamed. They were screams of pain. The largest lizard scattered his subordinates in different directions. He was very angry. The lizard opened its mouth and flames burst out. The explosions began to sound even stronger because some of the grenades did not explode due to the fall. And at the same time, other smaller lizards began to die. The flames expanded more and more. Visibility was zero, when suddenly the monster threw the ball directly onto the roof where the fighters were located. There was a crash and dust rose. As soon as everything became clear, wounded soldiers lay on the roof and the building was engulfed in flames. At this moment, our main character was already approaching the monster at incredible speed. He was approaching the surviving monsters. One by one, he killed the lizards. The monsters, seeing Jason, began to move towards him, making some strange sounds. Jason's eyes were like the eyes of a monster, and his speed was incredible for a human. There was noise in the street. People were screaming, a monster was screaming, and there was a smell of gunpowder in the air. Blade and Elsa fought the red monster. They fought in hand-to-hand combat, the huge creature holding axes in its hands. From the battle, it became clear that this creature was superior in strength to our heroes. He dealt crushing blows to our heroes, forcing them to go on the defensive. They both thought that they didn't understand how their boss could fight them since they were incredibly strong. But suddenly, Blade hit the monster's leg. Elsa started shooting at him at the same moment. The creature began to scream. It became angry. But Blade did not give him a break. He dealt a crushing blow to the head. At that moment, Elsa jumped up, holding a machine gun in her hand, at the end of which there was a bayonet knife. He stabbed it straight into the monster, and even the ground collapsed from the creature's fall. Blood splashed in different directions and there was silence. At this time, our main character continued his battle with numerous creatures, when suddenly our main character jumped up, jumping over several monsters. He walked up to his leader and stood face to face with him. The monster immediately opened its mouth and released a fireball towards Jason. But Jason immediately gathered energy in his hand. The fireball exploded before reaching our main character. The monster began to scream, and a slight pressure appeared in the air. Realizing that the ball did not hit the target, the monster immediately entered into hand-to-hand combat. The lizards that found themselves next to the leader were cut into small pieces in an instant. Jason took position. He was preparing to attack the leader. His eyes again took on a bestial look, and the leader of the lizards began to scream. Running up to Jason, he wanted to tear him to pieces with his claws. But our main character immediately attacked the creature with his dagger. The leader stopped, frozen in one position. Jason was able to split the monster in half with just one blow. The other lizards were shocked by this. They didn't even move. Jason smiled and said it was time to call it a day. After some time, silence reigned on the streets of the city. Some people were screaming from the building. After a few minutes, the screams stopped, and a large number of corpses lay on the ground. A man with a gun stood in front of our main character and shouted that he didn't understand how Jason could do this. Jason, turning away, said that he was passing by. The man in front, in turn, continued to scream. Jason told him which of them were still crazy, the dozens of bodies of women in the basement, dead from horror and abuse. But he also said that that wasn't what he was here for, but he couldn't accept it. He shouted that Jason was a bastard and that he should shut up. But Jason continued to say that the world was full of monsters and they should not be among them. Jason also said that he saw 5 shots, and that if he couldn't determine the weight of the gun, then he should at least take the distance into account. The man in front didn't understand what our protagonist was talking about. When he tried to fire, nothing happened, the gun was unloaded, then he decided to throw it towards our hero, but to no avail. The man talked about how he would not allow Jason to anger him, since he too was awake and had powers. He started yelling at our main character to watch carefully. He started using his power, lifting all the objects in the room into the air. But Jason gathered some of his strength into his hand and shook it. When suddenly the man began to fall, he did not understand what was happening. A second later, he was already lying on the ground and could not even move, and all the objects that had recently been in the air were already lying on the ground. He asked our hero where he got such incredible strength. 3 days ago, the battle between monsters of the 2nd and 3rd levels ended. Everything went better than our heroes expected. There were no deaths, minor injuries, all victims will recover soon. Everyone was pleased with the new ammunition they discovered. Jason praised his subordinates and also said that he was very glad that they were all alive. When Scott suddenly shouted that the boss should see this, he pointed to a place not far from their city. It had recently disappeared. Everyone was surprised that there was no green place nearby. They were discussing the fact that the monster had become invisible or moved off the map very quickly when Jason suddenly interrupted them, saying that someone was following him and might kill him. The others replied that this was impossible. Jason, interrupting them, said that perhaps the person who killed the green-eyed man would kill him in the future. He reassured his subordinates by telling them that now was not the time to talk, that he was now going to this city alone. He also gave orders that the main task was reconnaissance, as well as strengthening defenses and providing escape routes in case of any unforeseen events. Jason asked the man what he knew about the green-eyed monster and what happened 3 days ago. He said that 10 soldiers entered the city. They looked like special forces. It was already late at night. Jason asked him what happened next, to which he replied that after the special forces arrived, the monsters began to move and their numbers decreased significantly. Jason thought that the target of the special forces was clearly not the organization. At that moment, one of the broken legs rose into the air. It hit our main character right on the back of his head. The man lying on the ground was smiling. With incredible speed, this piece of garbage began to approach the back of our hero's head. But our hero quickly reacted and caught him with his hand. Holding it in his hand, he looked at the man with contempt. Having broken it, he asked him what it was, but he could not even utter a word. Suddenly, the man stood up and ran towards our main character. After some time, there was complete silence. Our hero left the building, breathing heavily, thinking about something as he walked. This guy was lying in the building. There was a piece of debris on the back of his head. He was dead. While walking down the street, an elderly man noticed something in the building. Approaching the building, he tried to see something. Once inside, he moved further and further. It was a meter. Some of the lamps survived. Jason thought he didn't feel anything, so most likely there were no monsters here, but some kind of anxiety did not leave him. It seemed to him that there was some kind of pressure in the air. It was the smell of blood. Walking further and further, he looked around. When he suddenly stopped in front of a large number of corpses, a stench hung in the air. Looking at them, Jason thought that they were mostly trained soldiers from the anti-terrorist unit. He looked at their features and thought about who could kill them all. His initial characteristics surprised our main character. All the skills he acquired were the same. He thought about gadgets and weapons. When he saw the PZF-30, he was surprised, because there should not be an anti-tank grenade launcher in such a place. Jason discovered an ancient warrior spear. The artifact level was 4th. He looked and thought that this artifact was disposable. But when 2 weapons were combined, the destructive power doubled. Even a level 4 monster would cause significant damage. Jason suddenly had the feeling that when he met that huge monster, he ran towards it. When he suddenly stopped abruptly, his face was frightened. In front of him lay a huge green-eyed monster. Sweat poured down his face as this monster's stats far exceeded those of anyone he had fought before. Come back. The strength of our main character was already 215. It was night outside. A cool breeze was blowing. Cries of surprise were heard in the corridor of the town hall. No one could believe that the green-eyed monster was dead. Because who could have done this? They said that they had a rather strong competitor. They also noted that in addition to their card, there was most likely another one. Suddenly, Jason received a text message on his phone saying he would meet him at the airport on March 3rd. Everyone reacted to this in the most violent way. Eve asked Jason if he was going to the airport. Robert said that the choice was simple, meet or refuse. He also asked the major if he would negotiate, to which our hero replied that he should avoid meeting with them. Scott began to sweat, saying that no matter how they saw it, there were many more of them. He thought it would be good to come to an agreement. They all said they probably don't need negotiations because they have no reason to accept them. Blade tried to make a joke to lighten the situation. Jason, interrupting everyone, said that they still have time to prepare. Now they must do everything in their power. He also ordered all the soldiers to gather. It was still night outside, a strong wind began to rise, and the weather worsened, as if warning of an imminent home. Monsters also ruled China. There were a large number of them. Red monsters darkened the street, their bodies completely covered in fur. In front of them stood people in ancient Chinese clothes. One of the girls said that she didn't really want to act first. But the cold-faced man advised him to stop saying nonsense, that they were here to liberate Chinese land, not destroy it. She replied that they were just thoughts. The girl played some kind of melody, her body began to glow, and the energy overwhelmed the rest of the fighters. The fighters began to glow and become covered in some kind of light energy. General Haru ordered to move forward. As soon as he shouted the need to attack, everyone rushed into battle. The fighters seemed to float in the air, and their movements did not resemble human ones. A rumble began, and a strong wind rose. At that time, all our heroes were working. She supervised doctors. She was sweating because there were a lot of sick people there. She looked out the window and saw the wounded and sick soldiers arriving one after another. The survivors helped the wounded walk, and screams were heard. At this time, Scott and Jason discussed what is the most difficult thing for ordinary fighters now. Jason talked about holding on, thinking about the future and Ella. After the appearance of monsters, the deserted city began to quickly collapse. Communications were immediately paralyzed, and electricity was cut off. Many people emigrated to another city. However, it is not so easy to kill one's own people, and many of them began to look for ways to solve the problems that had arisen. Engineers mastered the production of solar panels and began to generate electricity with their help. Everything possible was done to prepare the militia. With the help of search teams, the food problem was solved. Scott turned to our hero and told him that more and more people were arriving. In such conditions, he thought that he should probably think about the control system first. He said that they could call him whatever they wanted, that he didn't care, and so the guild gradually gained strength, strengthening humanity's ability to survive. We are transported back to the room. Jason was sitting in a chair. The divine thicket was empty. The city lay in ruins. Jason suffered greatly. His whole body was covered with wounds and blood. He could not utter a word. He looked at the ground, his hand was on the ground, and there were some people nearby. Jason wondered who they were. They, in turn, praised our protagonist for being a famous dragon slayer. Jason thought about the fact that they were speaking Chinese. He needed to learn it. Suddenly, behind him, he felt someone approaching. A man in a raincoat walked behind him. Having only had time to look at him, he saw a sword approaching him. He stabbed our protagonist from behind. This man said that it was incredible because it was a defeat for our hero. He asked Jason if he felt anything, but our hero just spat out blood. He asked Jason if he had anything to say. Jason in turn thought that he couldn't take it anymore because it pierced his heart. He thought that he needed to remember that there were 6 snakes here. The sword pierced our protagonist deeper and deeper. Blood flowed down the sword. When he suddenly pulled out his sword, our hero began to fall. Kneeling, he tried to remember as much information as possible. The man in front of him asked him what he was muttering, if he really made some kind of agreement. The man in the cloak said, laughing. The girls shouted at him to finish him off quickly, otherwise they would. Smiling, he swayed and told her that she had to come quickly, because the girls were already behaving badly. The sky was overcast with small clouds blocking the sun's rays. The man shouted goodbye. Jason woke up covered in sweat. His breathing was irregular. His face was covered with sweat. His body was shaking. Taking him by the hand, he said how good it was that he was in her place. He thought that what happened in the dream would happen in 3 days. Scott said that if in the future his nickname would be Dragon Slayers, then he would be finished. But how did he manage to lose in battle then? The guy wondered. Robert said we needed to go to the airport because there might be a runway there. Jason asked Scott if he recognized the man with the sword. Scott, seeing the sword, was surprised and started talking about it. The elder said that nothing was known yet, but if they could find at least some clues, then it would be good, when suddenly Blade burst out screaming. She asked what happened to him. Blade boasted that he had finally managed to defeat a level 2 monster on his own. He laughed, boasted. Everyone remained in a stupor because they thought that someone was attacking. Jason smiled. Ella held his head, thinking Blade was stupid. Everyone started praising the guy with the bat, and Jason started to walk away. The redhead looked at the departing commander, wondering what Jason was thinking. When the man left, he replayed a situation from the future in his head. It was March 3rd, and it was snowing at the international airport. Footsteps were heard at the airport, and there were whole destroyed planes. The atmosphere was terrible, because until recently, all these planes were transporting thousands of people, but now they are motionless. The group got out of the truck and slowly moved forward. Several Special Forces soldiers returned from a mission. They walked with their heads held high. It was clear from their faces that the mission had been completed successfully. They had new machine guns in their hands. The group of people was happy. Screams began to be heard in the building that Team D was on the spot. After some time, everyone lined up and one of the commanders shouted that the group was ready for battle. The commanders stood up and discussed their successes, saying that they could not even reach the orange level. They also said that there had been no news from Group C for a long time. Suddenly, the man shouted to get attention. Two men stood in front of them. One of them was Lieutenant Colonel Albert. Everyone saluted their lieutenant colonel. All the lights turned on and the room began to glow brightly. He shouted freely and then added that he would now describe the current situation. The man standing next to the lieutenant colonel said that Major Ricky had not yet attended any meeting. The fighters argued among themselves that the major could not be defeated. This option was only possible if he did not encounter something more serious than the blue level. When suddenly a man standing next to the lieutenant colonel shouted at everyone to shut up. The lieutenant colonel said they could have just gotten lost, but it was getting really bad for them to stay here for so long. When a sound was suddenly heard, everyone began to turn around. Lieutenant Colonel Albert narrowed his eyes and everyone became cautious. They began to raise the machine guns, remove the safety, and prepared for battle. Within seconds, they surrounded the lieutenant colonel, trying to protect him from danger. They said that the lieutenant colonel should not expose himself. Intelligence reported that only one man was standing. This was our main character. He covered his face with a hood. Suddenly, everyone rushed towards us shouting that we needed to check everything. One of the commanders was ordered to approach carefully. As they approached, they aimed at our hero, telling him not to make sudden movements. Otherwise, they would open fire to kill. The lieutenant colonel was informed that a young man was standing there. He said that his name was Jason, and also added that this boy wanted to talk to the director. The lieutenant colonel immediately asked the soldier his name, to which Jason replied. Albert immediately remembered that cold face. After a while, there was silence. All the fighters stood and watched with interest. Lieutenant Colonel Albert stood directly in front of our protagonist. He told our hero that he could not believe that Major Jason had survived, and after a while he added, "Although yes, how could such a fighter die?" Jason stood up and looked at him coldly. Everyone stood up and thought that the conversation was dragging on. They did not understand how the lieutenant colonel knew him. One of the soldiers suggested that he was probably a military man, but due to his age, it was unlikely that he was a senior officer. Jason suggested that he resolve everything through peaceful negotiations, to which Albert replied that he did not have the right to decide this on his own, and that cooperation with non-governmental organizations was not in his competence. He also added that his army would not be able to fight his fighters, as they had much more experience and more weapons. Jason silently began to remove the glove from his hand. The elder, showing a mark on his hand, said that if a battle begins, then half of the fighters will definitely remain here forever. Sweat ran down the old man's face. He wondered if he really intended to fight an entire army alone, although no, if we remember his past achievements, then anything is possible. A man was walking behind Jason. It was Major Ricky, who was calmly walking and finishing his cigarette. Turning around, Jason saw Major Ricky. All the soldiers began to rejoice at the return of the major. Ricky apologized to the lieutenant colonel for being late. Smiling, he saluting his commander. Suddenly, our main character realized that this voice reminded him of that person. After some time, the major reported everything to the lieutenant colonel. After the report, he asked Albert who he was and why this crowd was looking like it was some kind of performance. But without allowing Albert to respond, Ricky added that he believed the man was asking for cooperation so that he could continue to govern his city. Suddenly, the lieutenant colonel said, "Fist duel." 5 minutes later, Jason and Ricky were alone, preparing to fight. Everyone watched what was happening. There was silence. Major Ricky told Jason that he was interested in the skills of a fighter who served in the Secret Service. Looking at our hero, he said that he would die anyway. Ricky threw the coin, and as soon as it landed, a fight began. Suddenly, they took turns hitting each other. None of them were going to give up, defend themselves, and then attack. Their blows were devastating, and both demonstrated proficiency in hand-to-hand combat. The impacts were so strong that snow rose up around them. Jason didn't want to give up because cooperation was at stake, and Ricky couldn't lose either because it would be a shame in front of his comrades. The sounds of impacts echoed several meters around. The militants stood up and said that they were not people. They couldn't believe that anyone could fight on equal terms with Major Ricky. They said that Major could not lose because he had the nickname Rodmaker. They said that only he could cope with the threat of the yellow level, and if he had a team with him, then at least a blue one. But the lieutenant colonel interrupted them, saying that his major was now fighting with Major Jason. He was the only survivor of the so-called ghosts. He also added that they are legendary even among top managers, but only a small circle of people know about their existence, and they were used only in those operations that required something that ordinary people were incapable of, and at the same time Without wide publicity, only the combat unit could be used. After some time, the lieutenant colonel also said that he had seen Jason on business and still had difficulty remembering him. At this point, the fight between Jason and Ricky continued. Ricky began to get angry because he was unable to land a single direct hit. Suddenly, Jason, seeing that the enemy had opened up, struck him. After that, he began to twist her arm and hit her several more times. But he broke free, trying to push Jason away. Blood gushed from his mouth. Raising his leg, he tried to deal a crushing blow to our main character. But he dodged and kicked him. There was a crash. Jason continued to hit the Major, and after a few seconds, he was on the ground. It began to snow heavily, and no one could believe that Major could lose. They watched the battle with their mouths open, trying to support their commander. As soon as the snow subsided, Major Ricky lay down on the ground, and I stood next to our main character. After some time, the soldiers surrounded their commander and declared that there was no danger to his life. The lieutenant colonel spoke about the situations occurring nearby. He said that now out of 31 bridges, only 2 remain, the rest have been blown up. Jason asked Albert about the VIP status, to which he replied that they were worried about their safety. Our hero thought that the lieutenant colonel was lying, that they could not protect the president, and that now they were simply realizing their ambitions. But this could make the situation worse. Jason said that they will fight the monsters and use their powers to destroy them, and Albert said that they will help in cooperation. Handing the chips to the old man, our hero said that he found them in an underground tunnel. They dispersed, and the soldiers of the lieutenant colonel's detachment returned to the building. The lieutenant colonel seemed to suspect that Major Ricky would not be able to stand up to Jason, but it was still difficult to imagine that he would lose. He also thought that he most likely had a broken psyche because he had distinguished himself in many hot spots. The lieutenant colonel tightened his grip on the dog tags. Our hero walked and thought about the battle with Major Ricky. He thought he couldn't break it. Albert ordered his men to keep an eye on Jason, but also added that they should be careful, as he would deal with Major Ricky quite easily. When Jason returned, the lieutenant colonel's subordinates were already following him. When he suddenly appeared right in front of them, they were stunned by the turn of events. They could not understand how this happened, because literally now he was coming from below. They tried to attack him, but Jason was already gathering energy in his hand. He directed energy towards the fighters. The masked people were afraid to move because they knew nothing about the Major's strength. Suddenly, their body began to tremble and they could not even move a finger. Jason told them that he had no intention of killing them. They asked him what he wanted from them then, to which Jason replied that he wanted them to always remain in his sight for a crescent. Suddenly, his face changed. After a couple of seconds of silence, he added that there was another option, to send their bodies to the lieutenant colonel. The girl's name was Sergeant Julie, and the man's name was Sergeant Brad. Our heroes joyfully greeted their commander. The main character stated that the status of the president and prime minister is unclear. He also added that he wanted to kill Major Ricky, but decided against it for now in order to use the lieutenant colonel in the future. Scott said that thanks to the lieutenant colonel, they would be able to carry out government tasks while receiving rewards in the form of artifacts. Jason also added that artifacts are now worth more than any firearm. He also said that they would not beg or buy them, but should definitely give them to them. Julie and Brad couldn't believe their eyes. After all, they made a protective wall and periodically combed the perimeter behind it, installed solar panels inside, and organized work to cut down monsters, cleared the ruins of buildings and restored roads. The people who were here enjoyed life, and the military, of course, did the same. But everything there was based more on forced labor. After some time, our heroes again went to clean up. Sergeant Julie showed good monster-slaying skills. Sergeant Brad also destroyed one monster after another. The sword showed excellent abilities, destroying several monsters with one blow. Elsa did not lag behind and opened fire on the creatures. Spiders that got close enough were destroyed with a bayonet. Eve also destroyed monsters. Robert covered her. Suddenly, they found it difficult to breathe. They heard screams and turned around. It was a huge spider, their leader. He made very creepy screams. Showing his advantage over the others, Julie and Brad began to shake because in front of them was an orange level. Walking calmly, Jason shouted about why they were marking time, because this was not at all what they had to deal with before. He walked straight up to the leader of the spiders. Our heroes began to ask whether our main character could kill 6 yellow-eyed monsters at once. The newcomers listened to their arguments with surprise. The monster ran towards our main character. He, having begun to use the power of Black Death, also rushed towards the spider. A roar was heard and dust rose. On March 18th, a new meeting was held with the lieutenant colonel, at which Scott expressed his wishes. A small quarrel arose, but the lieutenant colonel silenced his subordinate. After they agreed, our heroes began to disperse. The snipers asked for orders from the lieutenant colonel. Jason felt that they were being targeted. He told the lieutenant colonel the exact coordinates of their location, and also added that if even one shot was fired, everyone would die, and also the next time the meeting should take place without them. Julie and Brad were shocked by what they heard, because the next mission could be the last for Jason's entire team. Julie and Brad asked the lieutenant colonel what was going on in Jason's team. Albert could not believe the words of his sergeants. After all, it is very difficult to deal with a yellow-level monster so quickly. Crisis always brings opportunity. Even if I manage to achieve a little success, it can greatly affect my reputation during a period of instability, Albert thought. He ordered his sergeants to continue monitoring Jason and his team. At this time, our heroes were driving and talking about some important person. Scott asked our main character what kind of girl she is, how important she is to national defense, this Katie. To which the man replied that she was the daughter of Ambassador Douglas. Scott only joked in response, saying that they were now messengers. Jason remembered the words of the lieutenant colonel, who said that he had changed a lot, exhaling heavily. He thought that he would have to change a lot more. Having reached his destination, our main character decided to explore the city from above. He climbed one of the tallest buildings. He watched what was happening in the city, trying to understand how things were here. At that moment, a crowd of monsters was trying to break through somewhere. Julie fell into a trap with monsters and had to fight. Just as the girl wanted to leave, she noticed a strange monster behind her, looking at her. Taking a closer look, the girl realized that in front of her was an orange level. As soon as the girl moved, the monster immediately rushed towards her, trying to attack. He suddenly heard the words of Jason, who said that once you have decided on a goal, you must move. He grabbed the monster with his bare hand and then lifted it up. Swinging, he threw it with incredible speed. Incomprehensible screams and cries of pain began to be heard. The monster continued to fly and fly, hitting the ground. Jason told the girl not to get up, but to follow him. A little earlier, Jason stated that only the sergeant should go with him to help him. After some silence, he explained that the lieutenant colonel here only has 2 people he trusts, and these are the sergeants. So one goes with him, the other stays here. Everyone stared at our protagonist, listening intently to his plan. Having told the plan, everyone agreed with it. No one had the slightest doubt, because they believed in their commander. After Jason destroyed the orange level, the monsters fell silent. The girl and the man were watching a group of people who were screaming quite loudly. The girl did not understand why civilians, that is, women and even children, attacked the militants. Even women and children fought with the militants, who in turn did not allow them to cross. Civilians shouted that the combatants had no weapons, so victory would be theirs. Shots began to be heard, and the smell of gunpowder began to rise in the air. Julie stood up and expressed all her thoughts out loud. Was that on the one hand there are children? Are they really going to be used as suicide bombers? Our main character said that in most cases, children under 10 years of age are used for terrorist acts, because after 13, there is a high probability that they will begin to reason. He also added that he could only cope with 2 tanks, which surprised the girl. Our heroes rushed into battle, their speed far exceeding human speed. Julie immediately began to show her superiority over the other terrorists. He destroyed them one by one, without even thinking for a second. At that moment, a loud buzzing noise was heard behind them, as well as the sounds of caterpillars tearing up the asphalt. The civilians were stunned, and in response the soldiers stood up and laughed because they felt that victory was theirs. Julie still couldn't believe her words because how could there be tanks here? In front of the tanks was our main character, who walked straight towards them, without showing the slightest fear. Jason was talking about how he didn't have time for people like them, while the team in the tank was talking about how the man in front of them was crazy. Seeing an incomprehensible glow in his hand, they immediately attacked the man. Our hero also responded with a volley of his own attack. There was a loud explosion and dust rose into the air. A few seconds later, both tanks caught fire. Julie and the others were shocked by this turn of events, because no one could even guess that an ordinary person could resist 2 tanks. Jason immediately rushed to the attack, drawing his katana. Everyone was surprised by the man's speed. Taking a deep breath, he said they were finished and swayed. A few seconds later, the tank's gun was cut into 2 parts. There was silence. Only the crackling of the fire could be heard. The tank was completely cut into 2 parts. A crowd of people was lying around. Julie still couldn't understand what had happened. The other people were also in shock and couldn't move. Jason grabbed the man by the neck and told him that he didn't know anything. He was just following orders. The man begged our hero for mercy. The sun was setting, and little by little darkness came. People stood up and looked at our heroes, arguing whether the army had really come for them. They also talked about how these 2 were much stronger than anyone they had seen before. Jason looked at the priest and asked if he was in charge, to which the priest introduced himself. His name was June. Jason immediately apologized and got to work. He was interested in the information. June held out her hand, showing where to go next. Jason saw the Saint's Cross. His safe as a relic was the 3rd. After some time, our heroes entered the building. The priest began a story about a green-eyed demon who rules his city. He is about 10 meters tall and is always followed by a crowd of smaller monsters. He killed many people, including a group of military men. Julie asked why no one had attacked the area, to which the priest replied that he believed God was protecting them, but that was not the case. He also added that one of the soldiers survived and can talk. Jason thought about how the cross kept monsters away from the area. They went to meet the surviving soldier. When they arrived, they were shocked by what they saw. Because of all the limbs of the fighter, only one hand remained intact. The man introduced himself and also said that he began the task on January 22nd. He said his mission was to rescue the families of ambassadors from several countries, including the United States, and to find recruits. He also added that there is a traitor in their ranks. He extended his hand, holding some figurine in his hand, and asked to take it. Julie took it and looked at her with a surprised face. The fighter, in turn, said that he should at least prevent the traitor from leaving, and at least somehow take revenge for the death of his friends. He handed Julie a clay figurine of a horseman. The level of the relic was the second. After some time, our heroes stood on the roof and talked. Julie said that the lieutenant colonel had assigned them 2 tasks, surveillance of Major Jason, as well as the return of relics lost during the failed operation. Naturally, the girl added that the second mission was a priority. Jason, drinking coffee, asks her if she really thinks he can take something from her, to which the girl replies that she understands perfectly well what kind of person he is, and therefore just wanted to ask him for cooperation. Julie said that she wanted to find the traitor and punish her, that she was ready to completely follow the orders of the major. Jason told her that he heard her. The girl looked at our main character and smiled. Morning came and a fresh morning breeze was felt. Suddenly, screams began to be heard. The man stood up and shouted about how ordinary people could defeat a tank. He was so angry. He thought that if his army reached them, it would be the end for them. He remembered how he was told not to disappoint him. Cold sweat ran down his face and his body began to shake. The man thought that they needed the cross that the priest always carries with him. There was a roar. It was an explosion. The wall broke. The man screamed when he saw our main character. Jason stood up, raising his head, and said that the situation was familiar to him, why they were standing to open fire. People around started screaming and ran towards the hero, but he immediately used his power and lifted people into the air. And then with incredible force, he threw them in different directions. There was silence. Only a slight wheezing from pain could be heard. Jason suggested starting a conversation. He immediately, in turn, stated that he did not know which person gave him the weapon. He also added that he said that government troops would arrive soon. In any case, in such a situation, our brother has nothing to wait for. He asked to forgive our protagonist, but Jason, in turn, said that he only deserved death. There was a crunch of bones as Jason threw the man's corpse to the ground. Our hero stood thoughtfully on the roof and looked into the distance. He thought that 8 snakes came out. There was a possibility that the manipulations of the High Ones were behind all this. Jason remembered her death and his fight with Mayor Ricky. Behind him stood Sergeant Julie, watching him. The major felt her gaze. He called her. She immediately came down from the roof. He ordered her to be sent to headquarters and a general meeting to be announced. The screams of the horse and the clatter of hooves were heard. Jason was fighting with someone, throwing powerful blows. With each blow, the dirt rose higher and higher. In front of our main character stood a horse with a rider holding a spear in his hands. It was a figure, 2 fighters looking at each other, waiting to see who would attack first. The horseman was the first to rush into battle, the roar of his hooves becoming even louder. After some time, the battle ended. The major stood up and thought that thanks to that paratrooper, he got a good weapon. Of all the relics, the national treasures are the clay figurine of a horseman and the golden crown, the whereabouts of which are unknown. So the possibility that it was returned cannot be ruled out, the man thought. The priest and his men were stunned. There was a loud stomp as a large army headed straight towards them. Elsa was in the lead, followed by our heroes. At that moment, our hero was already waiting for them, who looked at them, smiling slightly, because he was glad to see them all. Elsa immediately began to report on the arrival. 700 people arrived. 134 of them were hunters. The priest began to pray, saying that the Lord would really help them. Jason ordered them to gather in the conference room. Placing a map, he showed where the 4th level was. He said that there was their upper nest, in which there were about 5 dozen creatures, 6 hunters, and 10 soldiers. And as soon as the smoke cleared, they were supposed to destroy everyone who appeared. The monsters died one after another, emitting the same incomprehensible screams. Behind them stood larger monsters. Their level was much higher. These were 3 second-level monsters. Blade and Julie had to take care of them. Blade dealt colossal blows to the monster with a few swings of his new bat. Julie didn't lag behind either, destroying one. Robert defeated the latter, revealing that he was also part of our protagonist's main team. Another area had 50 first levels, as well as 2 second ones. Elsa took control of them, destroying them one by one. Eve helped her, also demonstrating great skill in handling weapons. Brad provided cover and launched numerous machine gun attacks. Near the park, there were a third and 3 seconds, plus more than 100 first. Major Jason went there alone. He called out to the rider, who wanted to fight alone. The elder spoke to him. Orange looked at our hero as well as the rider, not understanding why the man was smiling. He, in turn, advised the rider to have fun mentally, although this fun would not last long. The monsters charged, screaming and shouting. The rider also joined the fight, hitting the horse with his hooves. One after another, in an instant, the monsters flew away from the rider. They could not even touch him. He struck powerful blows with his spear, and gusts of wind scattered the monsters several meters around. Those who suffered from direct attack were divided into 2 parts, that is, in half. The horsemen moved further and further, destroying more and more monsters. The monsters couldn't even scratch the rider. Our main character rushed into battle after him, jumping over most of the monsters and going straight to the 3rd level. The monster tried to block the blow but did not feel it. It was surprised. A second later, it was cut into small pieces. Suddenly, he felt someone approaching from behind. Behind it was the 3rd level, which was already collecting energy to attack our hero. But the man immediately began to gather energy and also attacked the monster. There was an explosion. Jason's attack was much more powerful, so the monster took the blow. Orange got angry and screamed, but the major was already running towards him to kill him. With a swing of his sword, he cut it in 2. The man looked at the ground and the monster coughed up blood. At this time, the rider had already taken care of the rest of the monsters. His horse stood on its hind hooves and rejoiced. At this moment, cries of joy were heard in the central part. People were happy that there were no more monsters, and they had no one to fear. Our heroes stood on the roof and watched the cheerful townspeople. They discussed the fact that this was now their territory. Jason thought it was now the turn of where the bastard was. Sometime later, Major Jason, Sergeant Brad, and Julie met with Lieutenant Colonel Albert. The lieutenant colonel said that they ended up stealing a map of high mountains without knowing the situation, putting soldiers in mortal danger with many relics, all in order to hide a national treasure. Julie, in turn, said that all the time in the way they did this, of course, there are certain political subtleties and speculations associated with this. But the presence of a traitor is obvious, as evidenced by the testimony of the junior sergeant. Albert was thinking about getting rid of the rescue team. They took advantage of this. Is he really a major general? He also believed that one of the main tasks of the gendarmerie was to protect important individuals. His head was pounding, but the lieutenant colonel could not get rid of these thoughts. At this time, it was already dawn, and the noise of engines could be heard. A whole detachment came to search for the lieutenant colonel. They all could not stop discussing the situation. Albert began to walk away. The sergeants looked at the departing squad, and Jason immediately turned around. Sitting in the car, the lieutenant colonel continued to reason. Jason thought that once the situation improved and it was possible to import gas from abroad, this plant would become very important. So from this moment of taking over this region, the MEK Guild was no longer just a dangerous armed group. It became a threat. There were shouts from the headquarters about how to leave the traitor alone. The man told the lieutenant colonel that if the lieutenant colonel knew nothing about the traitor, then he might have accomplices. He also added that it is difficult in the army now. The slightest suspicion is enough to immediately lose your braces. On the street, one could hear the joyful cries of children playing with a ball. Albert continued to leave Jason, and the memories never left him. Night fell. Darkness reigned in the mountain tower. The air seemed heavy. The king's stone glowed red and was surrounded by armed men. 2 men stood in the tower and watched what was happening. The major general spoke about some problem in the region, to which the colonel replied that this problem would not become a serious problem. We were discussing our main characters guild, but suddenly the colonel said that in a pinch, they could accommodate monsters from another region, so there was no problem with that. The fact that it would now be impossible to penetrate this region even with a tank was also discussed. The major general was lost in thought. The colonel looked at him and could not understand what the general was thinking about. He asked the colonel what was happening with the 8th Division, to which he replied that it was currently being replenished with new personnel on the front line. The colonel replied that the terms of cooperation were unacceptable and time was needed. Suddenly, a man approached them. It was Major Ricky. They asked him why he suddenly came to them. There was a smile on his face as he handed them the letter. At that moment, a ship was moving through the water. Suddenly, he stopped, and a man in a diving suit approached the edge of the boat. He jumped into the water and then began to swim. Blade said that there should be no one at the bottom of the sea. Going there alone is still dangerous. Elsa revealed that John was created as a result of the draining and connecting of 3 islands as a result, so it is impossible to determine the exact location of the relics. Plus, the the bridge is now destroyed. Scott suggested simply blowing it up, to which Eve immediately said that if there was no bridge, it would be difficult for the survivors to get out of there, and besides, they had no evidence that he could not swim. Jason said his final decision was that the 100 people who woke up would set up an ambush in front of the bridge. You two would do it if the monster didn't disappear from the map within 4 days, he ordered Julie. And Brad leave. Swimming to the shore, he unwrapped one of the blankets in which PSG-1 was wrapped. Our main character, Major Jason, was in a diving suit and thought he was starting to destroy his target. At that time, monsters reigned in the city. There was a large crowd of them. The screams could be heard for many miles around. They destroyed everything in their path, moving forward and destroying more and more. Behind the entire crowd of monsters, there was also a leader. His size was much larger than the others, and his eyes were bright green. Our main character was already sitting on the roof and aiming at the monsters. He considered that at such a distance he did not have to aim, but rather put his energy into the bullet and shoot. The shot hit several goblins at once. The bullet flew at incredible speed, even passing through the wall. The monsters looked around. They did not understand what was happening now. The green-eyed monster watched and also looked around. Jason thought that the main thing now was to get the animals scared. He moved at incredible speed along the roofs of buildings. When the green-eyed man suddenly screamed, he began to make screams that sounded like calling calls. The smaller goblins also began to scream, making the same screams. When suddenly the green-eyed man hit the ground with his fist, killing several of his charges, after which he began to destroy everything around him, including attacking monsters. He ate several pieces. The animals were shocked by this. With one of his blows, he broke the building in half. Suddenly, a horseman appeared and watched what was happening. The green-eyed man immediately ran towards him. The rider raised his spear and prepared to attack. The huge goblin was many times larger than the rider and the horse. Our main character was aiming at the leader. He wanted to try to kill him with a rifle. There was a roar, dust rose from the impact of the wave, and nearby buildings collapsed. A fight broke out between the rider and the green-eyed one. On the roof, our main character also shot at monsters, like the leader. But the monster managed to dodge the bullets. The rider dealt a small blow to the monster. He turned his horse and prepared to defend himself. At this moment, Jason did not stop shooting at the monsters. The man managed to hit the monster, hitting it right on the head, and it, in turn, began to scream. The battle of our heroes with the green-eyed monsters did not stop. The leader received several blows but did not retreat. The major continued to shoot from afar. The bullets distracted the green-eyed man, and at that moment the rider struck with a spear. It seemed that the battle between the rider and the goblin was about to end. Both were not going to retreat. The leader continued to make strange sounds and screams, as if he was trying to say something. When he suddenly screamed even louder and rushed into battle, even the ground was torn away from his jerk, and the rider also went on the offensive. The monster jumped up, trying to land a colossal blow, but at that moment Jason was already right above him, with a katana in his hands. He was approaching the monster with incredible speed. Jason said that the monster couldn't get enough of the people and monsters in the area, and he even ate his brothers. What a creature. He plunged the katana straight into her head. There was a crash and the asphalt broke as the monster fell. At that moment, the screams of soldiers were heard on the bridge. They occupied the entire bridge and waited for the attack. Conversations could be heard between the fighters about what was happening now, because the monster had not disappeared yet. Julie was talking about whether everything would be okay. There were not only green ones, but also 50 orange ones, and over 100 red ones. When he suddenly shouted that even the green monster could not resist an experienced awakener, he asked Elsa what the chances were of Jason winning, to which she remained silent. When she suddenly said that she had willingly joined our protagonist's squad, and that the only thing she could do was believe in him, the others agreed with her. She also added that what angers her the most is that now the only thing she can do is wait. At this time, there was thick dust at the epicenter of the battle. Jason thought it was impossible to break the bones, but the sword went in perfectly when he suddenly noticed the attacking monster. Our hero immediately dodged the blow, leaving the sword on the goblin's head. He jumped a few meters. The leader looked at the ground in confusion. The goblin's face was covered in blood, and Jason looked at him with a smile. At this time, the action of the figure was already completed. The major said he doesn't plan to fight him to the death, but it looks like he has no choice. He picked up stones and boulders, and then with his strength directed the monster towards him. His speed was incredibly high. All attacks hit the target. The monster could only defend itself. He suddenly ran towards Jason and attacked him, but he managed to dodge. Our main character didn't even think about retreating, so he began to concentrate energy in his hand to attack. The fireball hit the goblin directly and he fell to the ground. The flame did not go out, but immediately stood up and ran towards our hero. The elder dodged one blow after another. He also hits the monster with his stone hand. Once in the body, the monster writhed in pain. and then he fell to his knees, groaning in pain. Screaming for him to die, our hero kicked him. The blow hit him right in the face, throwing the monster several meters back. But he immediately regrouped and approached Jason. He immediately attacked the hero, who had to take the blow on himself. The blow was powerful, throwing our hero away like a feather. But he was able to land on his feet. He moved away from the wall and gained good speed. And in a few seconds, he was again next to the goblin. He dodged attacks in the air, trying to get closer to the animal's body. When he suddenly found himself right next to the leader's face, he couldn't even touch it. Clenching his fist tightly, he punched the monster. The impact knocked the animal off its feet, and the sound of the impact was heard for several hundred meters around. Thick dust rose. Silence reigned in the area. The sounds of battle ceased. Once the dust settled, the goblin leader could be seen lying motionless on the ground. Our main character stood on his head and wiped his shoes on his face. He breathed a sigh of relief. The green-eyed man was dead. Elsa was holding the card in her hands when suddenly the green mark disappeared. Everyone began to rejoice, because the disappearance of the brand meant the victory of our main character. After a while, cries of joy began to be heard again. Jason returned safely to his main squad. Everyone started screaming in fear and joy at Jason's return. He, in turn, walked silently, smiling. Eve thought that if Major hadn't been with them, at least one of them would have survived. He alone destroyed a monster of this size. Not only ordinary people, even the awakened ones could not get close to this monster. Even if I had his abilities, I would never get close to such a monster. The weapons were greatly enhanced. Using stones obtained from monsters, the Mac Guild became stronger than other awakened factions. For example, the best archers of the Mac Guild can easily deal with second-level monsters. What if other awakened ones had the same power as him? Maybe these people will destroy everything in their path and exterminate people worse than monsters. How many people regretted being born with such monsters? Eve reasoned. Jason said that he would take a few people with him and go to Han. Just like in Chan, the remaining people settled in the town hall for protection. He also added that with the help of the map, it will be possible to find out where the monsters are heading. But the situation in the region is not entirely clear. The two of you will have to monitor everything and report on movements in both areas. Eve also reasoned that every time he very quickly explained the essence of the mission and carried it out just as quickly, she had the feeling that she had already gone through all this more than once. He, of course, was stronger than the others, but he didn't want his classmates to leave him. He had the feeling that he was going to leave us. The girl continued to reason. Hona International Airport was calm at that time. Upon entering the airport, the golden thicket was already full. Luckily, there were only a few henchmen around. Jason began rattling off a list of tasks that were coming to his phone. The first was to prevent the assassination of a colonel, the assassination of one of the leaders, and the third was to prevent a plan to melt down a nuclear power plant. Blade said things should get better after waking up, but I think things are getting worse. She added that she did not know anyone from this list, why it was necessary to kill someone. Robert said that an important issue is the nuclear power plant. Our main character, who needs to somehow explain the destruction of the nuclear power plant. To which Brad began to say that an accident at a nuclear power plant is an accidental overheating, during which partial fragmentation of atoms occurs, leading to the melting of fuel elements and other parts of the editor. Blade said in a surprised voice that this was great because Robert was very knowledgeable. Julie added that one of the areas of Special Forces training is related to nuclear power plants. Scott added that if the shell was damaged or there was a leak of nuclear fuel, then the teacher would have already told us. Elsa added that now everything can be fixed, at least stop them before something happens. Jason immediately said that the nuclear power plant was 60 kilometers from the events of the dream. If a leak occurs there, then under no circumstances can the city be used as a fortress. That is, at the time of my death in a dream, the nuclear power plant had not yet leaked, our hero reasoned. She quickly added that this could happen if someone deliberately tried to create a problem. Eve added that in her opinion, there is a high probability that the work of monsters is extremely large, but it cannot be ruled out that humans are involved. Jason immediately said that only a six-headed snake could come up with this. Robert said that in other words, this so-called snake was exiled by his master to another country, trying to take revenge. He decided to open Pandora's box in the form of a nuclear power plant. Scott asked with a scared look, "Is this really for attention?" Everyone was silent. Jason began to say that what bothered him most was the bombers that he saw before his death. Everyone asked in surprise what kind of bombers. Blade didn't understand. He asked them why everyone was so scared, to which Brad explained that only the United States had strategic bombers of this type. Jason thought that they should avoid all this, otherwise the Earth would end. Julie and Brad were shocked and scared at the same time, cold sweat running down their faces. When soldiers suddenly entered the room, Elsa asked them why they came without orders. The girl behind the fighters immediately apologized, saying that it was all her persistence. A girl stood in front of them. Her appearance was strange. Jason looked at her and thought that standing in front of him was someone who had woken up. Was it by chance that it was the same Kate? He looked at the major and asked if he was the commander of this detachment. At that moment, the hum of engines was heard on the bridge. Several military vehicles crossed the bridge at not particularly high speed. In one of them sat a lieutenant colonel who said that Jason decided everything too quickly. The capital army used its firepower and military elite to destroy the 10 monsters. In any case, getting here is very difficult. Currently, all forces are concentrated north of the river. Ultimately, the army and government had no choice but to reorganize, Albert reasoned. He also thought that it would never have occurred to him to call Major Jason. At the airport, Albert and Jason sat at the same table. There was pressure in the air. Our hero talked about finding Kate, but he is not going to tell the capital's defense army. Jason also asked the lieutenant colonel to arrange a meeting with Colonel June. Albert responded by telling him that if he were in his place, he would have done the same thing, after which he asked our protagonist what he was going to do next, to which he replied that he was going to Bue. Albert told him to remember that it was very dangerous there. No matter how many people were sent there, no one returned alive. But he immediately answered the lieutenant colonel not to worry. Now the most important thing is to meet with Colonel June. This must be done no later than July. The hero began his journey. He had Kate with him, whom he took with him to ensure her protection. Upon entering the region, distant sounds of creatures running could be heard. Approaching a little closer, many spider-like monsters appeared before our heroes. The cars began to rise into the air. It was the strength of our protagonist that lifted the cars. A few seconds later, hundreds of cars headed straight towards the crowd of monsters. They drove by without even getting out of the car. Kate was surprised, because she had never seen the strength of our main character before. Earlier, the girl asked our main character to accompany her to Bui. Everyone was surprised by his words, as they had previously talked about something similar. After some time, he added that for some time, he would not be able to reach the defensive post of the capital, where his father was located. Blade wondered aloud why Bo, but Scott suddenly shouted that he was going to take the large incense burner from the National Museum in Bui, to which Jason replied that this was exactly the case. The boy asked her if she was ready to go with him. There was a pistol and a knife on the table. The girl entered the fight. Jason watched her. Kate fired the pistol and released a full magazine. The red-eyed creatures died one after another. As soon as the cartridges for the pistol ran out, the girl began to swing her sword. All the monsters of the first level also died. Jason told him he had excellent training. After some time, he collected all the monsters' crystals, after which he handed them to the girl and told her to eat them. They continued on their way. The girl looked thoughtfully at our hero. He thought about what kind of person Major Jason was. He, in turn, did not understand why she was looking at him so intently. When suddenly Jason stopped abruptly. When she left, she began to look into the distance. The girl asked the man what happened, to which he replied that the man died 4 kilometers away. At this time, people were rampaging 4 kilometers away. One chased the other. The man ran away from his pursuer in fear, when suddenly a spear pierced his back. He was lying on the ground. They said that they were tired of just killing people. Brandishing a spear, the attacker ordered the lying man to die quickly. They began to prepare to leave. Suddenly, behind her, she noticed a man watching them. The surprised man was asked who he was. A few seconds later, all the attackers were already lying on the ground. After examining one of the attackers, he noticed a black stone sword. He thought that not a single fighter had returned from Buje. Why? When Kate suddenly started screaming, the older man looked at her in surprise. As he got closer, he saw that the man was still alive. He was talking about how they saved his daughter and wife to kill the monsters. When suddenly his hand fell, Jason closed his eyes. The girl asked the man why people fight among themselves and not with monsters, to which he replied that people began to kill each other from the end of the world. She asked if this happened in their country. Turning around, he said that he was the same as these attackers. The girl remained silent. At that moment, an incomprehensible atmosphere reigned in Buya. People were screaming in a large football stadium. People with machine guns were arguing that people from other units were now inactive and why only they should suffer. Our main character was already looking at them. It seemed to him that the scale of these places was much larger than he had imagined. Returning to Katya, there were people in front of him, whom he asked why they were following them, to which they began to say that they considered Jason good because he got rid of those bad people, to which Jason replied that he did not come here to save them, but so that nothing would interfere with him. He would take care of them. Everyone was surprised. They started talking about how it was originally a cult led by a woman. They were forced to join it. They kept the lower-level women locked up and abused them, and the men were forced to work themselves to death using a large incense burner. In the hands of a leader, divine beasts could summon it. Having told everything, they immediately began to beg Jason to save them and the others. Jason thought time was running out, and he needed to quickly come up with a plan of action. In some camp near Butte, in the mountains, screams began to be heard. The man ran and shouted something. A girl appeared in front of him, holding some kind of weapon in her hands. The girl immediately began to wonder what had happened, and also added that if it had not been something serious, she would have ended it immediately. But they began to talk about how an uprising had suddenly broken out in Buya, and several groups had already been destroyed. He also added that he heard that their leader was a woman with golden hair. After some time, the sounds of explosions began to be heard. The soldiers opened fire. The buildings exploded and caught fire. After the shelling, everyone immediately rushed to attack. The woman shouted that no one would be released and also ordered everyone to be killed. The man next to her said that he was not the one who thought that the unbelievers would resist, so they could only limit themselves to a large number of their people. But the woman replied that at such times it was necessary to attack safely. The soldiers, combing the area, wondered why it was so quiet here. They could not believe that after so many shells no one died. The woman, smiling, said that every rebel must be dragged and skinned. Our main character was already looking at her. Shortly before, Jason had given instructions to the villagers, stating that they would first have to fight them and then retreat to cover. People started asking our hero if he was really going to fight them alone, to which Jason replied that he thought he could finish them off in 10 minutes. A man approached the redhead and shouted her name. He ran a little closer, began to shout that there were no people there, but something strange on the horse overpowered his squad, when suddenly someone hit him from behind. He fell to the ground, a horse followed him, and the Messiah jumped. The squad located near the Messiah began to scream. The woman immediately began to use the artifact. She summoned a tiger and a dragon. The men stood behind her, saying that their commander was serious. The sacred animals appeared before the rider. The Messiah said that he did not know where he came from, but could not face his troops alone, and turning to his fighters, he ordered to find the one who controls this horseman. Suddenly, the wall collapsed, dust rose, a shockwave lifted people into the air and threw the fighters back. Everyone started screaming to look around. No one understood what happened, but our main character was already in front of the racer. The Messiah, looking at the elder, asked him if he was the leader of the unbelievers. At this moment, silence reigned in the tower. The fighters gathered around the head of the green-eyed man. Men in suits stood directly in front of his head. These people began to ask Major Ricky what he thought about this. He began to say that, in his opinion, there was no difference between monsters. They began to discuss the further course of action. They also discussed the fact that they do not believe that the Ministry of Defense is preparing such a dirty trick for them. As they left, one of them said he didn't think he would put his life in danger because of one person. There was a man standing next to Major Ricky. Ricky asked him when he would take care of him, to which he replied that now was not the time to take care of him. In response, Ricky just smiled, and the man tensed. He began to talk about the relic. It was called a white jade bowl. After a while, a certain number of relics will appear. They will need to be collected. The elderly man asked what could be done with it, to which he replied, "Whatever you want." Smiling, the boy replied that he understood. At that moment, screams were heard in the building where our heroes were waiting. Blade didn't know what the hell was going on. Blade and Ella stood still and did not understand what Scott wanted from them, which he asked them to look at. Standing in front of the map, he said that it was a level 5 monster, that is, a blue-class monster that was located in John City. Elsa shouted that they needed to get ready. Robert said that in his situation it's not that he can do the 4th or even the 3rd, to which Eva replied. But now not everyone understands what's wrong with the teacher, because there has been no news for 9 full days. Brad said with a scared face that even the Defense Army has nothing to do with the blue class. A cold sweat ran down Elsa's face as she thought about how long they would have to trust only the teacher. At this time, a battle took place between our hero and the commander of the believers. The girl was in shock. She did not understand how an ordinary person could be stronger than a monster who was summoned with the help of an incense burner. Jason and his rider easily repelled the attacks of the animals. As soon as the opportunity arose, the man immediately ran towards the woman. He used his flame power, but the girl knew how to defend herself. A little more and she would have been dead, he thought. Jason looked at her with contempt, thinking about something. Approaching her, the Messiah tried to attack our main character. She threw a stun grenade at him. The grenade exploded. No one saw anything. Everyone was blinded. But Jason was already behind the woman, his hand raised. He hit her right in the face. She, unable to withstand the blow, flew several meters back. The Messiah lay on the ground. He could not even move. On the floor, right at the feet of our hero, lay a Cyrillic alphabet. The woman struggled to get up. She started screaming that Jason was a bastard and that God's punishment would befall him. But he just looked at her with a cold gaze. Jason raised his sword, saying that if he wanted to be human even for a moment, he must die and atone for all his sins, and began to beg for mercy. Blood began to flow across the floor. Almost all of the Messiah's fighters were lying on the ground, and shouts of victory could be heard. Jason thought of a huge censer and a bronze statue of a bodhisattva. Holding the incense burner in his hands, Jason thought that he could easily destroy the level 3 monster. An excellent catch. Kate started yelling about whether it should come to that, but Jason didn't respond. She went on to say that with such powers, did she really need to kill them all? Among those killed were probably those who joined the sect against their will. Did you pay them with the same coin? The girl asked, and also said that this is not justice. Leaving, our hero said that there can be no question of any justice. This is revenge for what they did. As long as they remain enemies, they must die, the man said. And finally said that he used to think about death every day. But everything has changed. From now on, you fight for life, so sympathy is useless. Already driving in the car, Kente asked the major if they were going to hunt a level 5 monster in John. To which he replied that this is true, because it is necessary to build a base in the south of the province, and the presence of this monster poses a great threat. In John, Jason heard gunshots, but there was no pressure, meaning it wasn't a level 5 monster. He immediately ran toward the sounds, wondering what was going on. The two fighters stood in front of a horde of monsters. They said that they had run out of ammunition, and the rest of their comrades were dead. They were also finished. In front of them stood an orange monster, a level 3 monster. They said it was a shame that they were unable to complete the mission. A large crowd of monsters rushed towards the combatants. Suddenly, our main character began to use his power. The explosion occurred right in front of the two militants. The orange monster did not understand what was happening, but our main character was already approaching him. The soldiers saw little of the blast wave, but they wondered what was happening. Suddenly, the orange attacked our main character. A second later, Jason was standing behind the monster, holding his katana under him. The monster began to scream in pain, and a second later his body was cut in half. A small impact crater appeared around the monster. Kate and the soldiers looked at Major Jason in surprise. The fighters stated that Scott sent them to deliver a letter. The letter contained Scott's reasoning, in which he came to the conclusion that someone specially brought the blue-eyed man to the city. Jason immediately thought of a 6-headed snake, and the fighters too. Talked about how everyone was preparing to fight the monster. Jason thought that someone had summoned the monster. The power of the artifacts was involved. These two fighters, along with the others, left 4 days ago. But the day before yesterday, the monster overtook Chan. There is a high probability that now the city has turned into hell. If the military had originally wanted to destroy the Mac Guild, then not only would they have been allowed to cross the bridge, but the bridge was completely destroyed. No, it's not time yet, no matter what Jason thought. Everyone was in a hurry somewhere. She got into the boat. The boy stood with his head down, thinking that everything was not going as they had planned. The fighter reported that the bridge was destroyed. Everyone lowered their heads. At this moment, our heroes were heatedly discussing something when Scott suddenly shouted that this was a 6th-level monster, which was a dangerous criminal even for its owner. Elsa said in a calm voice that they do have a choice. They don't know where the monster came from or where it is going. They can't guarantee the safety of all citizens, so they must be prepared for war. Everyone was shocked. He also added that they need to gather all those who have awakened and are capable of fighting. Their goal is not victory, but resistance for as long as possible. Blade said she now understands why the commander entrusted her with command. She said that she would join them because medical personnel were needed during the battle. Scott said they can only hope the letter reaches the teacher. A few days later, the heroes began to fight the creature. Julie and Brad were lying on the floor, unconscious. Eva's condition was deplorable. She also lay unconscious. Robert sat leaning against the wall. He couldn't even move. The monster stood on top of a destroyed building, spreading its wings. Elsa and Blade's appearance was also deplorable. They stood with all their might. Suddenly, there was a roar. The monster attacked. She stood behind the wall, watching everything. The monster began to attack our heroes. They, in turn, prepared to take the blow. Blade raised his bat with all his strength. Elsa raised her machine gun. Their bodies were on the edge. There was a tank near the battlefield, as well as special military equipment, which was destroyed. There were an incredible number of fighters there. The monster stood in front of our heroes. The man watched the battlefield. Watching from afar, he said that he could not even imagine that they would last this long. He thought it would be interesting to see Jason's face when he returned. He suddenly started laughing. The monster began to scream, as if saying that the games were over, and now would be his last attack. Blade rushed into battle first, Elsa screaming at him to stop. The boy remembered the words of the major, who told him that he needed to fight as a team. The older man said that if Elsa and Blade worked together, they could defeat a level 3 monster, but that was no longer the case. So Jason at that point told them to retreat if the monster was a much higher level. Blade thought he was tired of retreating. Robert looked at Eve and talked about how he could believe he was fighting such a monster. She ran up to him, holding something in her hands, and told Robert to eat her quickly. He said that those who can move must be raised first, and why they have no choice but to retreat. Elsa shot at the standing monster. The girl managed to move and deliver direct blows. The monster began to scream even louder. He became angry. At this moment, Blade was already attacking him. Elsa thought the rifle was useless, and Blade thought his strength was now stronger than a cannonball. He delivered a direct blow directly to the creature's head. There was a crash and dust rose. Robert and Ella turned around because the sound of the impact was very loud. Blade stood over the monster's head and smiled. When Elsa suddenly shouted at him to leave quickly, he ran towards him. The monster quickly stood up and threw our hero behind his head. The girl received a direct hit. Our heroes scattered several meters in different directions. She called their names. Robert was scared. The girl immediately stood up. When suddenly there was an explosion, the girl turned around. Everyone was scared by the explosion. But as soon as the girl turned around, she saw a man standing right in front of her. Blade stood up with all his strength and said that he was not that easy to kill. Our main character stood in front of Elsa. Blade and Elsa were surprised. They didn't expect it to happen so quickly. The others were also stunned. The major immediately ordered the wounded to be taken and left. Everything else left in his hands, after which he praised them for holding out so long. Looking at the monster, he shouted to them not to stay there, but to leave as quickly as possible. After which he immediately rushed into battle. Elsa shouted that Jason could not resist this monster alone. When suddenly the sound of hooves began to be heard, it was the horsemen. And the animals, like the rider, appeared behind them at incredible speed. They couldn't understand what it was or where it came from. When suddenly Kate shouted that this was the relic she told them about before leaving. Kate, using the power of animals, remembered the words of the master. He gave her the relic. The girl thought that she didn't have as much energy as him, so he gave her the relic. The horseman was the first to enter the battle, striking with his spear. The rest of the animals began to throw the monster to the ground, and our main character was already in the air above him. Major Ricky was still watching the battle. I was not pleased that our main character arrived so early. Katya shouted that if this would not be a problem for them, then they should take out the bronze statue. She also explained how to use it. At the end, she added that she could not use 2 relics. Blade held the statue in his hands and looked at it. Elsa looked at the current master in shock, thinking that he had become even stronger. A fight has already begun between the monster and Major Jason. The monsters also attacked the creature, not allowing it to rest for a second. Jason looked at the monster with a cold gaze. Suddenly, a monster emerged from the dragon and ran towards our main character. He released several spikes, and naturally the hero easily dodged them. And a barrier was erected over our heroes to protect them. Jason began to chop down the thorns that the monster was throwing towards our heroes. Due to the fast movements of our hero's katana, a strong wind arose. The monster stopped attacking our heroes. The rider and the monsters began to disappear. Jason took off his jacket and threw it on the ground, ready to fight. He looked at the monster, studying it. Raising his katana, he said that he was thinking about fighting a level 5 monster and that defeating it would be much easier. Raising his daggers into the air, he said to the monster, "Let's do this." The monster began to scream, as if he agreed with our hero. Jason sent daggers towards the monster, and then he jumped high into the air. But the monster did not pay attention to the daggers. He immediately raised his head and opened his mouth, collecting energy in his throat. There was an explosion and flames rose. Everyone was shocked. They thought that the monster had hit the hero. He attacked our hero with some kind of lightning. Everyone was shocked. They thought that the monster had hit the hero. But Jason successfully dodged it, moving quickly on the ground and preventing the monster from attacking him. He continued to shoot some kind of beam at him. But the monster never hit Jason. Our hero thought that this monster has good hunting experience, which is why he fights so well. The monster has finally struck our protagonist. Jason's entire body tensed, and blood began to flow from his mouth. Dust rose because the shockwave was incredible. The older man was able to stop the blow by blocking the monster's beak with his katana. When our heroes saw Jason's condition, they tried to get closer, but he shouted that they would only be in the way. Jason's clothes began to tear as every muscle in his body was under critical tension. But he was able to escape. He attacked the monster and repelled it. Jason thought that he could not hold out for long. He needed to wait for the right moment to attack. The monster began to gather energy again. Everyone was shocked. Robert stated that his combat power far exceeded human capabilities. And suddenly Jason thought in his heart. At this point, the battle between the monster and our main characters continued. Jason used all his strength to create the moment to attack. As soon as the monster hesitated for a moment, Jason immediately ran towards him. He plunged the katana straight into her chest. He started screaming in pain and started to pull away. Everyone was speechless because no one could believe that their commander could defeat the monster alone. The monster began to attack buildings. With one paw, he tried to grab the major, but he managed to jump to the nearest building. The man thought that this was his last chance, so he needed to act in his own strength. He began to accumulate energy in his hand. At this time, the monster had already begun to attack our hero. Jason gave his last strength and screamed. Suddenly, a katana pierced the monster's heart. The creature froze and began to descend. They both started falling to the ground. The fifth level was defeated, but our main character's injuries also turned out to be critical. After some time, our heroes carefully approached our hero and helped him. He climbed onto the creature's head and walked slowly, swinging his katana. Everyone was screaming as level 5 had been defeated. Eva lay down on the ground and looked into the distance, smiling. Julie and Brad also began to stand up with surprised faces. Major Ricky, watching the battle, could not believe his eyes. Angry, he broke his binoculars. Jason stood over the bird and looked into its eyes, when he suddenly waved his hand and took out a blue stone. Everyone watched Jason carefully. No one knew what would happen and who the awakened one would become if he ate the blue stone. The eldest swallowed the stone and there was silence. Ricky thought this shouldn't have happened. He got on his bike and rode off. Sometime later, Major Jason and Lieutenant Colonel Albert met. We talked about meeting with the colonel and the defense commander. The lieutenant colonel listened carefully to Jason, and after listening to him, said that he would make a new date with the colonel. Albert also told Jason that he probably wouldn't be able to negotiate calmly, to which our hero replied that he was not only thinking about negotiations. At this time, people were shouting about some kind of rally. Suddenly, Scott yelled that it was time to take a break. The current battle has resulted in numerous casualties. The survivors and wounded were sent for treatment and recovery. Although not many fighters remained, for some time they did not have to worry about monsters. This killed creature was so large that other monsters looked like ants against its background. No one was allowed to be alone. Scott looked at our protagonist and thought that after all, it would be much easier for him alone. Scott ordered everyone to go to the workshop. When they entered, they saw a creative mess. Everything was scattered. They were greeted by Redval. He immediately greeted them and then said that these were weapons and armor made from the teeth and bones of the orcs and the Vulture King. He began to talk in detail about what he had done. Everyone listened attentively to the story. Kate will use the incense burner to focus on defense, and Ella will receive a bronze figurine to heal wounded soldiers. The rest received weapons, which they had to quickly get used to. The weapon felt heavy and difficult to use, but in reality, everything went wrong. Jason simply upgraded his old katana. Jason took Scott with him on the trip, and they were also accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel Albert. Scott could not believe that the neighboring town had been so destroyed, to which the Lieutenant Colonel replied that if it had not been for the dragon, the town would have been saved, with Albert also stating that they would not be able to cause the slightest damage to it, using all your firepower. After Albert said dragon, our main character immediately remembered this monster. Suddenly, the military cargo stopped. The Lieutenant Colonel opened the window and asked why they were stopped, to which the fighters replied that they were currently fighting monsters and that the exact number of monsters had not yet been established. There were shouts nearby that a new wave was coming. While they were being shot at, the soldiers shouted not to let them through. The soldiers continued to shoot, and the smell of gunpowder was thick in the air. The monsters began to break through. The first row of fighters began to retreat when Jason appeared in front of them. He told everyone to back off and shut their mouths. The monsters were still approaching, heading straight for the fighters and our hero. Jason, when asked who he was, replied that they would definitely find out who he was. He threw the cartridge straight into the crowd of fleeing monsters. After some time, our fighters arrived, entered the building, and began shouting Jason's name. Everyone was shocked to see him repeating his name. The senior officers were silent, looking towards the entrance. Jason walked into the building with a smile on his face. The lieutenant colonel was smoking a cigarette and, looking into the distance, something confused him. Exhaling heavily, he took a deep drag on the cigarette and threw it away. The commander and the major were sitting at the negotiating table. Jason glared at him, showing his displeasure. The commander, in turn, tried to understand what our hero would now demand. The rest of the fighters were also tense because there was pressure in the air. Scott, standing next to the elder, thought that everyone was very calm and sweaty due to the atmosphere here. The commander was the first to initiate the conversation, asking Jason if he really came to ask for compensation for the damage, to which he replied that this was exactly the case, as well as a reward for a level 5 murder. The commander, in turn, said that they call themselves an independent organization, but they ask the military for a reward. The commander also added that they came here to threaten, to which Jason replied that if they want to accuse them of something, accuse them. When suddenly the man shouted that he had had enough. Our heroes were surrounded by soldiers and machine guns were pointed at them. Some fighters remembered the strength of our protagonist and were afraid of even the slightest movement. Jason exhaled as calmly as possible, after which he stated that he did not threaten anyone, but only asked for payment. Suddenly, a wind appeared in the room, which began to knock everyone down, exerting incredible pressure. Jason released a small portion of his powers. All the fighters were trembling and did not understand what was happening. Jason asked them if they really wanted blood to be spilled. Everyone began to tremble even more as a stern aura emanated from our hero. Suddenly, the general announced that his proposal had been accepted. The colonel tried to dissuade the general, but he closed his mouth. Additionally, after some time, the general added that he had one condition. They must take care of a green rank monster that was heading to the mountainous area, which Jason agreed to, but also added that they must give him the 4 relics. When our heroes left, the colonel asked the general why he decided so, to which he looked at him with a contemptuous look and said that he was an idiot. He added that they could execute the guy, but they shouldn't risk destroying him. He also talked about how he now has no choice but to pay. Going outside, he met Major Ricky, who greeted him. Jason, for his part, remained silent. Extending his hand, he told our hero that they had already met once, but then they could not properly get to know each other. Suddenly, the teacher interrupted him, saying that they had seen him twice and that he should not accidentally forget him in Bucha. They walked towards the bank. Scott wondered if the two were actually going to fight. He thought that now would be the best time to go in search of the relics. Ricky scratched the back of his head and told Jason to break up with him right then and there if he didn't like him. Jason asked him why he brought a level 5 monster to Butch, to which he replied, and that was it. He began to talk about a relic called a white jade bowl. He said that this bowl, after introducing mana into the relic, a drink is formed in it. When you drink it, an aura is created around you that attracts monsters. To which Jason replied that now he was starting to understand. On the way home, Scott told Jason about the relics he had captured. They began to talk about a 6-headed snake. Jason also said that he would cooperate with anyone in any case, only his guild would benefit. After a while, Jason said in a rough voice that he would deal with a level 4 monster. When they reached their destination, they saw many corpses of dead monsters. After walking a little more, he noticed a creature in the distance with 3 glowing green eyes. A 3-headed creature appeared in front of him. He immediately rushed to the attack, intending to kill our hero. He prepared to take the blow. The monster's screams were a terrifying level 5 scream. There was a noise that spread for several kilometers around. Lieutenant Colonel Albert was in charge of all this. The combatants were also close, and there was tension in the air. One of the fighters holding a camera said that he expected a lot from the blue-level monster, but not that the fight would be one-sided. Suddenly, the lieutenant colonel gave the order that it was all over. They were returning. Our main character stood up and looked at the monster lying on the ground. His entire body was mutilated and also torn into several parts. Jason took the green crystal from the animal's body and ate it. Several other men also watched the fight. They were stunned by the strength of our main character and could not believe what they saw. 2 militants noted that they were afraid to give him the letter because it seemed to them that he would also kill them, like a monster. A quarrel ensued between them. A man stood behind them. Feeling that someone was behind them, they immediately grabbed their weapons and turned around, aiming at the man. This man turned out to be our main character, Major Jason. He praised the fighters for their excellent response and also suggested that the general had sent them. The letter was handed to him, and he began to read it carefully. Having finished reading, he crumpled up the letter. 2 soldiers asked the hero if there would be an answer to the general, because he ordered to return to him. To which Jason said in a cold voice that he should be told that if he wants to die, he should go with him. The fighters were surprised. At that moment, a noise was heard in my head. The table was broken, and the people nearby frowned. The person who broke the table was saying that this bastard is actually trying to gain autonomy to absorb the entire Zhong zone. 2 fighters announced in trembling voices that the flag of the Mac Guild had been raised on John. The 2 men made sullen faces. At this moment, our heroes gathered at the city hall. Scott outlined the area with a red pen. He was saying that since they had secured the natural gas and oil base, they no longer had to worry about energy. He also believed that the remaining religious fanatics would be exterminated in the near future. Scott suddenly noticed that the bowl was full of liquid. There was silence. The fighter handed the liquid to the major, who drank it to see the expected future. He saw in the future what the Mayan calendar received. He saw some people attacking and shouting that only the Dragon Slayer remained. They also shouted that he had received the dragon's curse. As he fought them, Jason's skin took on a gray tint. When he suddenly woke up, this time his body did not tremble, but he was tired. Jason thought it was just a bad dream. He told his partner about what he had seen, who began to discuss it heatedly. She talked about the fact that Stonehenge is in London and also talked about the curse. A girl and a boy joined the discussion. Jason said it would soon become clear whether this was the future or just a dream. Moreover, our protagonist began to claim that the defense line had many relics in stock. The strong defense of the capital was probably waiting for the enemies to start destroying themselves, because they only had enough food and energy for 6 months. But after some time, he added that they could only monitor the actions of both sides and wait for the right moment. Suddenly, there was a cry that they understood everything. After some time, there was to be a meeting. Jason took Elsa with him and a dozen fighters stood before them. The guild leader and general's eyes closed. Everyone introduced themselves. The general continued the conversation, saying that based on the letter, they should have realized that they needed their help. So if they did not want the army to send weapons towards the guild, they should go help them. To which our hero clearly answered that if they are going to be threatened, then we must try to fight them. The general said he couldn't trust them, to which Jason replied that he didn't care. He wanted to hear the reason why he should choose his side between the two sides. When Jason suddenly added that he had a proposal, the general fell silent. Our hero suggested that he transfer command of the detachment to the soldiers. The soldiers behind the general began to become indignant. After some time, our hero announced that he was collaborating with the capital's defense contractor to recognize autonomy, and after a while he would send the killer to the colonel. With a cold face, he said that if they trusted him, he would have no reason to refuse. There was silence. The general was stunned by the major's proposal. He asked the guild commander what he would have left if he surrendered his fighters. To which our hero answered unequivocally, he will still be alive. At that moment, screams were heard again near the head. The man stood up and lit a cigarette, anxiety and tension showing on his face. Two men a little further away noted that they had already suffered huge losses at Honorable. When they suddenly approached the man closest to the window, he told them that at first the general was inclined to the idea of nuclear weapons. But they, in turn, began to say that this was not a very good idea. They were silent, looked into the distance, each was in his own thoughts. At this time, Lieutenant Colonel Albert was talking to Major Jason. He told the major that ensuring the safety of nuclear power means not only visiting nuclear power plants and planting flags at them, but also ensuring that the nuclear power plants are operating reasonably safely along the way. Scott, who was nearby, said that if all went well, they could take the relics of the Buddha temple, the tablets of the Great King, or even the Golden Lord. The lieutenant colonel said that at the moment, 2 monsters of the 5th and 4th levels have been identified in the area. This will be more difficult than ever. Suddenly, Jason said he refused. He explained this by saying that guarding the path along the mountain was very dangerous. He would have to use all the human resources of the Mach Guild. He was not going to sacrifice his people so that the enemies could attack from behind. Albert, with a surprised face, asked Jason if he really thought that there was a spy in the capital's defense command, to which he replied that if it was impossible to destroy the parasites, then their leader must be killed. But Albert also said that he understands that Jason has enough power to kill them, but they need fighters and awakeners to protect the civilians. That's what the general does. When Jason suddenly interrupted him, saying that he had already met with the general, the lieutenant colonel couldn't believe what he was hearing. After several seconds of silence, he added that exactly 13 minutes ago, the general became a member of the Mech Guild. The Mech Guild accepted the nuclear safety request. Lieutenant Colonel Albert reported. He was making a report to some high-ranking military officer. A man nearby said that his comrade thought that the MEC Guild would want to use the nuclear power plant as their own. He continued to wonder when suddenly the commander ordered him to write everything down. He said hello and left. At this moment in the tower, the 3 men were still talking. One of them said that Mr. Mao's Jade Bird had arrived. It said that reinforcements had been sent from Japan. The man thought that he needed to find the Golden Rule and the Flute of Immortality as quickly as possible in order to take control of all the capital's defense forces and then get rid of the general. At that moment, the noise of trucks was heard in Vaughn. The goal is to ensure the safety of nuclear power plants and, first of all, to secure the road. Thirdly, constant protection of objects. 1,000 people will go to the mountain, including the awakened ones. There are no rules in this hunt. Everything you get will be yours, Jason said. At this moment, silence reigned in Chan. The fighters moved with incredible speed, their faces covered with masks. One of the masked fighters talked about how they were going to attack the Mac Guild. He said that these were ordinary rebels. While Jason was away, it was time to attack. The first goal is to capture the town hall building. They also needed to buy enough time for Japanese reinforcements to arrive. Using the Jade Bird, he sent it flying into the air. He asked him to tell him what he had just said. The bird began to fly further and further, and after a few seconds disappeared. The masked fighters continued to approach the guild. At that time, Ella supervised doctors at the Chong Hospital. They discussed the fact that there were 1,300 bags of medicine left. She said that 300 kilograms should be allocated for a group of recovering patients and the amount of medicinal water should be reduced as much as possible. Scott turned to the woman. She asked him how it went, to which Scott replied that it would all be over soon. There was a masked man on the roof watching over the hospital. At this moment, masked militants were already approaching. They commented to each other on the radio that the undercover agents had reported that there were no security enemies in the hospital, only doctors. Entering the room where they were supposed to be received by an agent who was supposed to give them an access card, they saw a tied-up woman lying on the floor. The radio began to broadcast that Group A had been destroyed by the Awakened. The masked fighters began to fall to the ground one after another. Our protagonist looked around the room. The radio was screaming at the group to report the situation. The screams did not reach the radio. No one responded. The man on the roof winced and thought they knew everything. He immediately wanted to leave and report everything to his boss. He immediately took off, moving at incredible speed. At that moment, there was silence in the tower. Everyone was waiting. The lieutenant colonel said the special forces use infiltration, assassination, and kidnapping skills. He also added that he couldn't believe that someone else was trying to kill Jason. It was a waste of time. The man on the roof had already informed his boss about what had happened. The boss listened to his subordinate's story with fear. He started yelling at her, saying that everything should have ended well. When the subordinate suddenly sensed danger, he shouted to his superior to jump. But he didn't have time. His leg was pierced. A cry of pain. His subordinate managed to dodge the blow. Our main character, Major Jason, appeared before him. He said he couldn't believe he was allowed to remember the old days, but there was nothing difficult about getting into them. He, in turn, called our hero. Removing his armor and scabbard, he released his power. He shouted that he would kill him. After that, he immediately rushed towards Jason to attack him. His speed was incredibly high, and in a split second, he approached our hero. But he was able to easily dodge the attacker's blow. But he tried to attack again, but Jason blocked the blow. He then struck him straight on the chin, and then he plunged the sword into his leg. A second later, the attacker was already lying on the ground. Our hero's hand hardened. His gaze was frightening, telling him to think carefully. There were shouts and screams. The boss sat with a grimace on his face. His subordinate lay on the ground covered in blood. The man sitting on the ground asked to kill him, but Jason replied that he had no plans to kill him. After a while, he said, "Six-headed snake." The man was surprised. He asked our protagonist how he knew this, to which our main character answered the questions asked to him in a rude voice. The first question was why they made a deal with someone else, if they had an agreement with him. To which he replied that they sent monstrous stones that they managed to obtain during the hunt. In exchange for relics and information, he was tasked with finding the real artifact. He spoke of the Flute of Immortality and the Golden Ruler. Jason thought about it. He thought about the actions of the six-headed snake, as well as the artifacts, when suddenly some hands took the boss by the shoulders. He got very scared, screamed. Jason turned around. A grenade was flying towards him at high speed. Our protagonist managed to react by raising a barrier to protect himself from the explosion. Masked fighters appeared and threw shurikens at our hero. But Jason immediately began to use his power. The masked fighters began to fall to the ground one after another. When they suddenly began to retreat, it seemed that they were simply distracting our hero's attention. Jason noticed this and immediately turned around. He saw the leader lying on the ground, his body covered in blood. Looking at the lying fighters, Jason thought about what the ninja were trying to prove. If they really wanted to show their confidence, our hero also thought about the relics of another country and the six-headed snake. He reasoned that Japan's strength should not be underestimated, but its army was small and the situation was much worse than theirs. He declared out loud that he could not allow enemies to set foot on this land again. The wind began to pick up and pressure appeared in the air. The soldiers returning from the forest reported to their commander that they had seen the man for the first time. But his strength was incredible, and the aura emanating from him was terrifying. They further added that despite this, the assassination mission was completed successfully. His commander thought that the authorities had long been dissatisfied and could avoid suspicion of his death. Thanks to this man, in addition, this man's relationship with the six-headed serpent made it difficult to attack these lands. Suddenly he shouted, "What a great job!" and they returned. When he suddenly threw a dagger straight at one of the fighters. He, in turn, jumped back. It was our main character. He caught the dagger right in front of his face. The nearby ninja fighters immediately jumped back. They were afraid of Jason's strength. They did not understand when he managed to confront them, because they were retreating at high speed. Jason asked them why the hell they were breaking into foreign lands, and he got angry. When their commander suddenly shouted that they should not stand, but attack, everyone immediately ran to our main character. The kunai that Major grabbed began to glow blue. A fight broke out between our main character and the ninja fighters. One by one, they flew away from the hero and could not even touch him. A minute later, the last ninja fighter fell to the ground. His commander was shocked because he could not even imagine that such a strong fighter was in front of him. At that moment, an explosion occurred near the tower. The soldiers were ready. One of the fighters shouted that he was coming so that no one would show their heads. Their commander watched all of this silently as they gathered, after which he radioed that when Major Jason arrived, not to attack, but simply send it to him. He thought that he should be careful and wary with this man, because it was difficult to guess what could be expected from him. He also remembered the past and thought that it was originally impossible to become their enemy because they were the ones who created this monster. In the boss's memories, our hero's face seemed stern and merciless. He remembered him as a killing machine with no emotions. The radio said that Jason was in the air behind the glass. The commander approached the glass. The eyes of the major and a member of the high command met. The old man asked the guy how he was going to control and manage the citizens in the future, to which the guy replied that of course he would not be able to rule the country, including the civilians, but that the 8th Division would become part of the MEC in the future. Guild. The elder was surprised. He could not believe the major's words. When he suddenly laughed, the Mech Guild commander didn't understand why he was laughing. At that moment, screams of soldiers and the hum of equipment were heard near the station. The Mech Guild fighters stood and waited for the leader's orders. Elsa said that as soon as the negotiations are completed, a signal will be received from the master. Soldiers in camouflage uniforms also prepared for battle on Goethe Street. One of the fighters said that he was very nervous. They had planned this event many times, but had still not been able to implement it. A loud sound of engines began to be heard. It was the sound of tank engines. It was a clear day in Tokyo at that time. In Edo province, screams were heard from the castle. There were flames burning inside the castle, expanding and expanding with each passing second. There were 4 men dressed in old samurai costumes. When he suddenly shouted that Mr. Musashi had arrived, everyone knelt down. The girl stood up and looked straight into Musashi's face. The man asked him where the militants were, because they were supposed to return, but had not returned yet. One of the fighters said that the boss is very strong and that he must return. Smiling and looking around, he said it was time to go. The tower stood in the dark, glowing red. Fighters continued to come and go, the team getting larger and larger every few minutes. Along with the roar of engines, people's screams began to be heard. They were scared. They didn't understand what was happening, why there were so many soldiers here, whether there really were monsters nearby, they thought. The child began to cry. One of the men began to shout at the woman to shut up the child. The soldiers riding inside the truck were subject to reprisals. The military knew that in the worst case there would be many casualties. The men in white shirts walked around in handcuffs and were arrested for attempted sedition. In front of them stood Lieutenant Colonel Albert, who held his head high, showing his superiority. The man with glasses, seeing the lieutenant colonel, called him a traitor. But Albert was not surprised. He replied that he was a traitor because he sold the country for his own good. After that, he shouted to the militants to take him away, and also authorized the use of force if they tried to throw something. At that moment, near the station, Blade shouted, calling for the master. Jason returned to his comrades after negotiations. They surrounded him, starting to find out what was happening there. After some time, the lieutenant colonel was already on the roof and smoking thoughtfully, followed by 2 sergeants who were looking after Jason. He thought that the chief and major were killed, and the remaining colonels and subordinates would be punished. The situation is rapidly changing, and the Mac clan is destroying everything in its path. Subansa and the 8th Division became members of the Mech Guild, leading to a reorganization. Roads were cleared to facilitate the transport of food and ammunition. The Awakened destroyed monsters in the surrounding area and suppressed individual groups. The main ones hunted monsters of the 3rd level and above. However, only a few days have passed. The changes are just beginning. The entire command gathered around the map and said that there were well-guarded fortresses nearby. Scott added that there is a temple in Chan that houses the relic of the Great Tibetan Non, but even the approximate number of monsters located there is unknown. This artifact is comparable in power to a silver cross or pure rain. Elsa said that it was in this area that the 2nd operational command was located, and apparently it would be easy for them to defend themselves from attack due to the characteristics of the territory. Jason, interrupting her, said that the 2nd operational command does not have tank or artillery units under its command. He believes that in this case, the support of the chief will not hurt them and he can be recruited. Albert said that the 6-headed snake will collect the most powerful artifacts to ensure the safety of the fortress, and those who can obtain the artifacts first will have an advantage in the battle for monster stones, which are the most important currency of the domain. In this era, Jason said that in addition, the information received suggests that Japanese troops are planning to enter our lands, using them as a springboard for domination. He also suggested that they already know about the death of the leader. The general also began to talk about this topic. Elsa asked Jason if he was serious about crossing the mountain, to which he replied that it would not be easy, and they could suffer heavy losses. They need to very calmly arrive and clean up. Sweat ran down the general's face and he asked if he was going alone, to which Jason replied that he thought correctly. At this time, shots were heard in Daegu, surrounded by mountains. The streets of the city were empty. The girl quickly ran. His gaze was a little frightened and sweat was pouring down his face. She was pursued by several armed soldiers who shouted at her that she would not run far. They screamed at her to give up, but she screamed at them to get as far away as possible. The girl hid behind a concrete wall, after which she began to aim at the militants who were pursuing her. She started shooting at them, and the military immediately began to retreat to cover, after which they opened fire on the girl, who in turn took cover with a wall. As soon as the fire stopped, the militants headed towards the stairs to go upstairs. Suddenly, one of the fleeing militants fell to the ground. The others began to fall behind him and someone shot them. They shouted to the surviving fighters to retreat and hide. Suddenly, a grenade flew towards them. There was a powerful explosion. Two men ran up to the girl and asked if she was safe. She started yelling at them because it was dangerous here, and they, in turn, said that they couldn't leave her. After a short discussion, they left the building. The girl was worried about her classmates. Sweat was running down her face. They stepped back carefully, looking around to make sure there was no line behind them. One of their comrades urged them on because someone was waiting for them. Suddenly, the man behind him shouted at him to retreat, but it was too late. The ninja fighter attacked him. Fighters appeared in front of them. The commander of the masked fighters ordered to quickly kill them, but then our main character appeared. His gaze was as stern as always, and his aura was intimidating. The man with glasses slammed the table angrily. He shouted why no one had come yet, because they must have already caught this girl, and at that moment the subordinate consoled him. Hearing the words of his subordinate, he thought that it was true that, as a last resort, the Japanese would intercept him. Jason looked around as if trying to find someone. The men and the girl were scared. They did not understand who was in front of them and what they wanted from them. The ninjas began to surround them. At that moment, the men raised their machine guns and started shooting. But they did not wait. They attacked in response. One of the men already thought that his life was over because there were no options to avoid it. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, he was thrown back. The blow was strong. The crunch of bones was heard. The man nearby also did not have time to dodge the blow of the katana. But then our main character appeared again and managed to protect him. The rest of the ninja fighters immediately attacked him, shouting that they needed to kill Jason as quickly as possible. But the elder had already released his power. Using it, he threw the attackers back. A loud sound of bones was heard. Moans were heard. People fell from the sky. At that moment, our hero walked past them. Their commander quickly approached the attack undetected. He had a smile on his face, but Jason kicked him in the leg as clumsily as possible, causing him to stumble. He didn't even understand how he ended up in the air. But he quickly regrouped and tried to attack the teacher, but he hit him in the face. Jason seemed to lightly touch him, but the fall broke the ground. Looking at the standing men and girl, he asked them if they had taken control of this area, and if so, he would ask them some questions. They were stunned by what they saw. They could not believe what they saw. The girl remembered how she recently sang professionally, and thanks to her frequent appearances on screens, managed to gain enormous popularity. However, when he returned home from work, the whole world turned upside down. The reality is worse than in the movies. He didn't even realize right away that this was the real world, because when he was driving home from work and saw the monsters, he thought they were making a movie. At that moment, he realized that he needed to get to Seoul. In this case, she would not have to see either monsters or the antics of crazy idiots. For some reason, then Getu was free from monsters. Therefore, all the survivors moved there, hoping that they could unite all their strength and overcome this hell. Therefore, they followed the second operations command located there. In addition, she always gathered and calmed people, taking advantage of the fact that she was a celebrity. They sincerely believed in her, which brought considerable benefits. However, at some point the situation changed, and the second operational command began to perform strange actions. They began to send people to the lair of monsters, where they forced civilians to work. She could not understand why tens of thousands of people with crooked shovels and lanterns risked their lives trying to desecrate the royal tombs and tombs. She later learned the real reason why they needed to get out of those very tombs. But this is not so. It didn't matter anymore. Since then, there were only two categories of people left in Getu: those who had already been taken away, and those who did not want it. The last leader of the rebels was Joe, and she sincerely believed him, so she became a member of the resistance. The girl told her story while in the warehouse. At the end, he added that their leader was kidnapped by this scum. Our hero asked them what they were going to do next, to which the girl firmly replied that they were going to save the leader. The boy immediately asked them if they had any plans. He also told how his leader was captured. Jason told them that if the military could get information from their leader, they would fall into a trap. Jason turned and walked away, saying he would save their leader. They were confused because why would he save him? At this time, silence reigned near Daegu City Hall, and night fell. Moans were heard in the basement of the building. The beaten man was sitting on a chair, his clothes were covered in blood. His entire body was mutilated, with nails protruding from his hands and feet. The mouth was tied with a rope. There was not even a place to live on the face. The door to the room opened and two men entered. They were Japanese. One of them was wearing a military uniform, and the other was wearing samurai armor. The rope was taken out of his mouth. The man in turn immediately asked why they were returning, because they would not break him. The Japanese man in military uniform said that if he accepted their offer, they would help them. The tied-up man, smiling, began to say that this was an excellent offer, but he simply needed to get rid of the major of the second operational command, because now he needed not only to improve the climate, but also to increase his salary. When his face suddenly changed and he added that "Stop playing soldier, the country is rotting because of you." The man in military uniform replied that he was still alive because they want him to be like that. After which, smiling, he said that the girl would be caught by ninjas. The man got angry and insulted the man in front of him. When gunshots suddenly began to ring out, the bespectacled man shouted that he needed to leave. The bound man wondered if it was really them. At that moment, the military shot the attacker. The attacker was our protagonist, Major Jason, who had erected a barrier around himself to protect himself from gunfire. The soldiers were shocked. They could not understand who was in front of them and where he got so much power from. Suddenly, 3 soldiers arrived with a grenade launcher. Jason raised the barrier around himself again. There was a powerful explosion and the walls collapsed. The soldiers lay on the ground. Jason slowly moved forward. There was a crash and Jason broke down the door. As he walked further, he found the commander appearing right in front of him. Jason thought the situation wasn't that dangerous. A man sitting in a chair asked our protagonist who he was. The girl standing on the street was thinking about how everything was happening there. Suddenly, 2 men appeared, one of whom was holding the other by the neck. The girl shouted to her classmates not to shoot. The girl asked who it was. Jason was silent, looking at them. After some time, he replied that his name was Jason. He was the leader of the Mac Guild, which owned several territories and regions. He asked why they were fighting with them. After some time, groans were heard in the warehouse. Jason was still holding the man by the neck, and his entire body was covered in bruises. He asked our hero to kill him. As he left the warehouse, he was attacked by men. He wiped his hand with a handkerchief and they were stunned. The girl asked her if she knew any man. Sometime later, they were driving in a car and talking about their leader. Driving through the city, they saw destruction. There was a lot of broken military equipment lying around. The militants fled when they saw Jason, calling him a monster. With his own efforts, he cleared the road, throwing out cars and tanks. No one was even going to fight him. Everyone immediately ran away when they saw him. Addressing his new companions, he said that they could not go further, that they either stayed here or returned. Jason asked the man in front of him what his name was, to which he began to ask why he didn't answer who he was. The elder was silent, looking at him with a cold gaze, when suddenly he felt danger from behind. Quickly drawing his sword, he repelled the attack. The man behind the teacher asked him what was going on here. The samurai stood right in front of our hero, holding a katana. The man began to say that this samurai was very strong and one should be careful with him. The samurai said that he considered Jason a worthy opponent. He thought that his abilities weren't that strong, but he couldn't judge him on that basis alone. Someone like him might have the ability to improve his abilities. The samurai shouted that his name was Kojima. No matter what he did, the sword would be with him all his life. Jason, in turn, did not respond. The enemy ran to the teacher, saying that he would no longer need the name, because now he would die. He thought he was level 4 in Kendo, but regardless of rank, he had few opponents. When the world changed, he wasted away in boredom before having fun, because he could swing the sword as much as he wanted. However, monsters could never satisfy his sense of power. Sometimes he had to deal with others like him. But they were no different from monsters. The power and artifacts he received were not used properly. A lot of time has passed since then. The samurai were still thinking about the same thing. The swords of our heroes were touching each other. A moment later, Samui was on her knees. He couldn't get up. He didn't have enough strength. He didn't understand what was happening. The ground shook and cracked right under him. The air pressure caused the bound man to tremble. Jason carried himself as lightly as possible and held the sword, showing his superiority. She asked him if that was all he wanted to show him when he suddenly screamed. Somehow he managed to escape and jump on our main character. But the master's movements were much faster. His sword ended up under the attacker's katana. His hands were cut off and the ground was covered in blood. Our heroes were near the map when suddenly a letter arrived. It was said that the temple was destroyed, and the reason for this was Japan. Carefully monitor the movements of the monsters in the P's and withdraw the troops waiting nearby. It is also necessary to lead the monsters through Joe. They told the lieutenant colonel. He said that there was nothing strange in their actions, but it was stupid to spoil the collection of Tibetan writings. Scott pointed his finger at the map and said that the evidence was that a large number of high-class monsters began to move around the temple and entered the security zone, which had a radius of 40 kilometers. Elsa said that they cannot watch from the sidelines. They need to do something. Our main character was on the roof, followed by a girl with a stroller in which a man was sitting. Everyone was silent, looking at our main character. The man sitting in the chair thought that this man was able to destroy the mayor's office of Getu City. But this does not mean that the second operational command was destroyed. The mayor's office was one of many headquarters. He must do it somehow. Make a deal with him. He suddenly said that he was a little rude at the first meeting, asked our hero for forgiveness, and also thanked him for the medicine he gave him. And suddenly Jason spoke and asked him if he knew the temple scriptures. The man shouted that it was impossible to destroy the manuscripts. The teacher said that it was his mistake. The information he received after interrogation indicated that Japan had known about the existence of these relics for a long time. He believes that they realized that they could not be transported, so they were simply destroyed. The man was shocked by the words of our hero. He lowered his head and felt sad. Jason said that this is not such a problem. They are now among the 5th-level monsters. Very soon they will arrive in these lands, to which the man was even more stunned, because they had already finished. He talked about how more than 6,000 people and 400 awakened people died at the hands of the green level. He started taking out the catheter, saying that something had to be done because everyone was going to die. Jason approached him and told him that they had a lot to do in the future, so he needed to take care of his health first. He then added that he shouldn't worry because he would take care of this monster. At this moment, silence reigned at the airbase. A man in the building shouted that City Hall could not be destroyed. I thought that they had recently lost contact with the Major General of the Capital Defense Forces after he said that he wanted to come to them to seek refuge. Suddenly, a bullet pierced the glass, breaking it. It flew straight at the airbase commander's head and pierced him. His blow was so powerful that it broke the wall. The general fell. All the soldiers began to shout about what was happening. Looking out the window, they saw a man standing with a stroller. Their former comrade and current commander of the uprising was in the carriage. They recognized him. They started shouting for him to quickly come down and grab him, when suddenly one of the militants shouted that this was the same man who was in the city hall. Everyone came out and stood in front of our main character. One of the fighters came out, introducing himself as a colonel, and asked what they needed, to which the man in the carriage replied that he knew that most of the relics brought from the tombs were here. He told them to bring him the king's divine bell, to which he shouted that he really thought they would just give it to him. Suddenly, the screams of the monster were heard. They were terrifying. The militants immediately began taking aim, shouting that everyone should line up and no one should run. The man with the stroller asked them if they remembered the green-eyed monster. If so, then now a monster much worse than him would come. He started shouting that he was not going to negotiate and that they would quickly drag the relic away. There was silence. Everyone was left in bewilderment. At that moment, screams of people were heard near the city. A huge crowd of monsters destroyed everything in their path. A huge monster was following them. His eyes were blue and the air seemed to make him shiver. Suddenly, the monsters began to hear some kind of call. It began to call them. At this moment, our protagonist rang the bell. Its power was that all the dark forces had dissipated and the monsters had weakened. Jason remembered talking about how the city was attacked by a green-eyed monster. He also thought that he should be as careful as possible because they were different from those he had fought before. The monsters did not understand what was happening. They began to tremble. Some fell. The blue-eyed monster began to scream and scream. It was as if he was trying to reason with the rest of the monsters. Our main character came down from the roof straight to them. They noticed that our hero was drooling from his mouth. Jason told them to shut up and then pulled out a gun. It was a huge minigun. The teacher started shooting. In a split second, the monsters scattered into small pieces. The blue-eyed ones ran towards our hero to attack him, but our hero dodged with a smile on his face. He began to climb to the roof. Then he continued shooting from there with a machine gun. The building in which our hero was located began to petrify, turning into a kind of glowing stone. Jason quickly jumped off the roof. He tried to stay away from the stone monster. He thought he didn't have enough ammunition. He threw the machine gun aside. Pulling out his katana, he engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the monster. At the same time, he began to release his firepower. But the monster was not going to defend himself. He attacked in response. The rock and the flame collided, and a strong wind arose. The blue-eyed people tried to trample our hero. but he knew how to react quickly and dodged the attack. He immediately launched a fire attack. Parts of the stones that were on the monster's body scattered in different directions, causing chaos in the area. At this time, Amir was sitting on the roof. He and his comrades watched the battle and were shocked. The girl behind her remembered her conversation with Jason. Standing in an armory, he was asked if he was going to form a team. Jason replied that he was not going to form a team. He told the girl he wasn't sure he could use it. There was a crash and dust rose. The monster did not stop attacking our hero, but he successfully dodged all attacks. Approaching the monster, Jason tried to attack it, but he began to release some energy from his mouth. Jason thought that the sword was too short and would not be able to hit his heart. He erected a barrier in front of himself. The monster fired lightning from its mouth directly at our hero. The Elder's barrier withstood the attack of the blue-eyed monster. Suddenly, torpedoes began to appear behind our hero. Using his power, he directed them towards the monster. The monsters looked into the air. Some of them even managed to escape. Jason smiled, laughing and saying there would be a big explosion. All torpedoes were aimed towards the monster. He, in turn, tried to defend himself by raising a stone shield above himself. There was an explosion that destroyed everything. Jason began pulling out artifacts. Some of them he had already used, others were new to him. By putting everything on himself, he released their power. Animals and horsemen appeared. They were ready for battle. Jason fell to his knees and thought that the effect was simply incredible, but the risks were great. The shield withstood the powerful explosion, leaving the monster unharmed. He screamed and got angry. At this moment, our main character had already put on his mask. He was overwhelmed with power. All of his combat skills increased several times. Even the air around them seemed distorted. The blue-eyed monster tried to attack our hero. He was furious. But everything seemed to slow down for him. Now his speed was several times greater than before. He immediately dodged the attack and headed towards the monster. Approaching him, he released a fireball, but the stone beast was able to defend himself. As soon as the smoke from the explosion cleared, Jason was already next to the monster. It pierced him, breaking his body. He moved very quickly. The blue-eyed man had no time to follow his actions and no time to defend himself. The monster regenerated, but Jason did not stop attacking it. He jumped straight onto the monster's head, gathering the remaining energy into his katana, after which he dealt him a colossal blow. Jason cut the monster in half and blood began to pour out of it. The monster was successfully defeated. At that very second, Jason fell to his knees and his strength gave out. He immediately took off his mask. His whole face was covered with sweat. His comrades on the roof watched the battle through binoculars. Suddenly, one of them said that it was all over. The soldiers on the nearby roof could not believe their eyes. They stood in bewilderment, discussing the battle. The colonel, bowing his head, ordered everyone to gather, after which he added that they had surrendered. After some time, everyone gathered again at the airbase. The rebels pointed their guns at the military. They, in turn, remained with their weapons lowered and their heads bowed. The colonel told Jason that he was transferring all his power to him. The rebels were glad to hear this, because the war between them was over. Amir exhaled lightly and Jason drank his coffee. Officials associated with Japan involved in radiation contamination of water and massacres will be thoroughly examined and punished. However, there was a long way ahead. There were no military forces here, and although the townspeople no longer had to work hard, the monsters surrounding the city of Geta made this place unsafe. Thanks to Jason, losses were kept to a minimum, but no matter how strong he is, he alone cannot guarantee the safety of all areas. Amir said that although military guards were organized, these people had never encountered monsters, so it would be difficult. Among themselves, the rebels said that they had never seen a squad destroy monsters so easily. After which Amir said that they have the banner of the Mac Guild. The sound of armor was heard. Blade, Elsa, and Ella moved forward. Scott and Robert walked not far behind them. The lieutenant colonel's detachment arrived from Seoul. The Mac Guild was brought before the rebels. They, in turn, were shocked that several groups of awakened people appeared before them at once, and their aura was terrifying. Amir said in a trembling voice that these were the people they were talking about recently. Jason confirmed that this was the Mac Guild. After some time, he added that from now on they were his allies. Each of them greeted Amir. He, in turn, began to talk about himself. He also apologized for greeting them sitting down. Scott pointed to Ella, said that they have excellent doctors. They will cure him. Robert drew attention to Layla and said that she was a celebrity. Elsa apologized, after which she turned to the teacher, saying that they had disobeyed the order, that she was ready to take full responsibility and was ready to accept the punishment. The superior men said that they had all agreed on a plan together, to which Jason replied that it was the right decision. They said that most of the monsters had been destroyed, to which Blade, laughing, said that they left the monsters starting from the 4th level to the master. The situation changed instantly after his arrival. Everything happened quickly and in an organized manner. They also took care of the monsters leading to Geta. At the same time, they devoted themselves to rebuilding the city. Mass treatment of the wounded began in hospitals. Amir also felt better every day. In addition, they did not forget to get rid of traitors. Jason devoted himself only to destroying the most powerful monsters. Elsa said that 3 monsters of the 3rd level and 2 individuals of the 4th live in this area. Gary was talking about sending armored vehicles to guard the nuclear power plant. Jason gave the orders. She had to prepare the medical supplies. Kate had to use the incense burner to focus on protecting this place. At that moment, the screams of monsters were heard at the nuclear power plant. A crowd of monsters tried to enter the station. The soldiers in turn shot at them, not wanting to let them get close. One of the fighters, who ran up to the commander, said that they could no longer resist. The armored vehicles were completely destroyed by a level 4 monster. He replied to gather all the people in one place. The level 4 monster was getting closer and closer. The fighters lined up and prepared for battle. A green-eyed creature appeared in front of them, when suddenly the monster's attention focused on the sky. An explosion occurred, destroying the small monsters. It was our main character, the green-eyed one, who used magic to protect himself. The monster immediately began to use magic to attack our main character. A wall of water rose and some lines began to appear. The elder swung his sword, sending an aura towards the ice shield. The shield split and small fragments of the shield flew towards the monster, after which Jason dealt a crushing blow to the monster. A strong wind arose from the speed of our hero. The soldiers watching the battle could not believe their eyes. After dealing with this situation, they went to Seoul, where they were finally able to go out into the outside world after 6 months of living in hell, along with his relics like the king's divine bell, and also 2 powerful katanas. It seems the curse was not lifted. Maybe he didn't find a way. This room seems to be the information that he left for himself. Apparently everything here is very valuable. If he tried to remember everything that is in this room, he would have to fall into a near-death state even more. One day, at this moment, painful cries of creatures were heard in the cities. The guild fighters shot them, but they were able to move a little further. The second-level monsters were able to defeat ordinary fighters. They, in turn, began to retreat so that their ranks would not decrease further. Elsa also participated in the battle. Using his strength, he delivered devastating blows, charging the bullets with his energy. Blade fought as a team with her and also attacked creatures. His blows were much more useful than Elsa's. The fight ended. Elsa radioed that they had successfully completed it. Eva and Robert joined them and also said that they had cleared the mountain from the other side. From the east, Julie also reported that all was clear. Gary, hearing the message that it was his turn, ordered everyone to get ready. In front of them stood huge 155 mmKN 179 guns. Huge explosions began to sound, sending smoke into the air. The soldiers guarded the bell by ringing it. The cannons were fired to clear the rest of the area. After some time, the explosion stopped and there was silence. The commandos stood up and watched everything through binoculars. They discussed how incredible this power was. They melted the bronze swords and will use them as projectiles. One of them said that he was ordered to form a machine gun unit. Gary started talking about absolute orders. Suddenly, the world collapsed, and a large number of people died without knowing the reason for what happened. After the army that was supposed to protect the people began to slowly lose their humanity, after the disaster, all the suffering fell on the survivors. Of course, they resisted the monsters in order to survive, but it took a lot of effort to get them at least some information. But the knowledge gained could not change the situation. First of all, monsters are incredibly powerful creatures. For example, if a detachment of troops can destroy a monster of the 2nd level, then even after regrouping it, will not be able to defeat a monster of the 4th level or higher. Weapons, strategy, tactics, alliances. All these elements have always placed man at the top of the food chain, but in the face of powerful monsters, they lost their importance. No one expected that a simple change of commander would directly change the situation. Suddenly, there were shouts that someone wanted to go to Japan. Gary asked what the reasons were for hunting a level 5 monster. Jason explained his position by saying that there is a man named Musashi living in Japan. I dreamed about him a few days ago, and moreover, he is sure that the incident in the city of Daegu is connected with him. He also said that the 6-headed snake is now in China, but in any case it may end up here. Before he left, Jason wanted to get rid of the powerful monsters. Jason also wanted to deal with the level 6 monster to ensure the safety of his comrades. They needed to show their true strength so that others would fear them. Our heroes fought a blue-level monster. As soon as they discovered him, they immediately started shooting at him. They also struck the bell to weaken it. The monster began to get angry because unknown forces began to take away his strength. A man was approaching him. This was our main character, who had already used the animal summoning artifact. The monster noticed our hero, who in turn thought that he needed to be dealt with as quickly as possible, since time was running out. He immediately went into battle, trying to hit the monster. The animals dug into him with teeth and claws. The sounds of battle could be heard throughout the area. Our hero's comrades were nearby and used their powers to help him. Blue-Eyed was losing. He was attacked by animals. Small fragments of fighting were scattered for several kilometers around. Our main character flew through the air using his strength. The entire personal detachment of the Major watched the battle. The fight did not stop for a few seconds. None of them could even catch their breath properly. Everyone was looking forward to victory. Jason's eyes suddenly took on a feral look. A second later, the animal was cut into two parts. Huge dust rose into the air. It seemed as if Jason and the monster had woken up in the air. Elsa radioed that the situation had been resolved. Gary tightened his grip on the radio and said it was a victory. All the fighters began to rejoice that the monster was defeated. At this time, it was night in Tokyo. The fighter who was next to Musashi said that everything would end very soon. Musashi, in turn, replied that how many people died did not matter at all, because after the victory, they would be able to join the ranks of the working regions of the guild. He thought that the six-headed snake would also invade them. This masked fighter also said that there had been no news or communication with the militants sent to those lands for a long time. Jason, Albert, and Gary were standing on the pier and discussing something. Jason told them to focus on the electricity and wait. He would contact them very soon. Gary asked the departing Jason if it was really a war. He also added that he never thought that he would be in the center of such events, to which he replied that one should not give in to emotions, only those that they have never seen. War can really appreciate this. Suddenly, shouts were heard that they were swimming. Gary continued to argue with Albert about Jason's words. The water was calm and it was deep night. Suddenly, the soldiers began to shout about the approaching ship. Everyone began to take up their fighting positions. They shouted that an unidentified vessel was approaching. Everyone should be on alert. The militants began to run out of the buildings, grab weapons, and line up. Shouts began to be heard over the loudspeaker asking them to stop and introduce themselves. Otherwise, they would start shooting. But the ship ignored them. After a few minutes of waiting, they opened fire on the ship. An explosion occurred and the ship was destroyed. As soon as the shooting stopped, a man loomed directly over the military. One of the fighters radioed that the situation had been resolved and the ship had been destroyed. While in the air, our main character Jason watched them. The city of Kitakyushu in Fukuoka Prefecture stuck to its traditions, namely swords. In the Kitakyushu town hall, there was a stronghold of one of the detachments. The man said that a week after the sudden collapse of Tsushima, the number of monsters began to rapidly decrease. Kyushu branch manager Hiyoshi Tai said he did not have the funds to compensate the victims' families. Kyushu is home to the eight-tailed fox, and the best place in the area is near the port. He exhaled cigarette smoke with some heaviness in his soul. Jason, observing the city, thought that this is a city of drugs, prostitution, murder, human trafficking. In addition to the Yakuza, this is the city where all the criminals gather. He also thought it would be a good place to hide. Suddenly, screams began to be heard from the establishment where our hero was resting. One of the men shouted that we need to go where chaos reigns in order to absorb the territories. They also began to joke that swords used to be decorations, but now they are the main weapon. They also discussed that in the lands they wanted to go to, there was a strong man riding a horse. They also said that they could deal with the Mac Guild within an hour. Suddenly, one of the men started shouting that they had a problem because Musashi was going to send troops there. Suddenly, in the bar, our hero began to say that this was logical because everything had been planned for a long time. He also asked them, "Kenji Nakagawa, this man is actually the head of Kitakyushu." To which they took out weapons and began to shout and ask him who he was. To which he turned to them and replied that he asked the questions here. Suddenly, the bottles on the bar counter broke. They scattered in different directions, after which they began to fly into the air. The men standing in front of Jason could not understand what was happening. As soon as they shouted fire, all the crystals flew towards them. Screams of pain began to be heard. There was a crash. The wall of the building broke. Their leader was still standing. He asked Jason who he was, to which he replied that he didn't care what condition he was in. He needed answers. But he tried to attack our hero, shouting at him not to be so impudent. But he successfully dodged and hit his attacker. He then snatched the sword from his hands and struck him several more times. Grabbing the sword, he cut off his own hand. Literally a second after the start of the fight, the attacker was already lying on the ground. The man stopped the bleeding, after which he began to talk about how at the beginning of 2017, sea monsters, 4 of them, settled on a Japanese island. Subsequently, monsters began to appear everywhere. This was accompanied by earthquakes, typhoons, and tsunamis. After the disasters stopped, Japan was on the verge of destruction. It was at this time that the savior Mr. Musashi appeared in the country, drove out the monsters, and founded a new empire. This man, he is going to classify and divide people by building a new power. The man began to shout that Mr. Musashi is like a god, and that Jason will never be able to compare to him, when suddenly Jason kicked him in the throat. Jason thought that if Musashi went this route, things would be easier. He asked the bird to convey his words to him, and it took off. A monster of the 6th level was mentioned, as well as one monster of the 3rd and 4th levels, an 8-tailed fox on the mountain, a white snake, and a giant turtle in the gorge. Jason thought about starting with the weak ones. At that time, the squad was worshipped in Musashi province. 4 heavenly kings sat in front of him. Musashi said that this is impossible. Now that the island is taken from them, they need to lead the army. They also said that they would have to cross the 8-tailed fox to get to the port. Musashi began to shout in disgust that China had already been able to reach his lands. Everyone listened carefully to Musashi's words. His last words were that we could not wait any longer. It was necessary to organize a hunt for monsters. He gave the order to everyone to prepare for battle. Jason's first specimen was a snake. Its size was amazing. It made snake sounds, but the air pressure was terrifying. Jason stopped right in front of her, preventing her from moving any further. His hand hardened. He smiled and told her that she would be his first victim here. Almost immediately, a fight broke out between them. The main character began to climb the building. The snake began to wrap itself around the building, squeezing it and breaking it at the same time. Having risen to the top, he began to use his power. His energy was much more powerful than that of the snake. He pushed it away. Losing his balance, he fell to the ground. The major's fist tensed. It hit Yellow Eyes right on the head. His sleeve could not stand it and began to tear. Victory was our main hero. Screams were heard in the port. The splashing of water could be heard for several kilometers around. A huge turtle reigned here. Seeing the man standing, he threw himself to the ground. She immediately ran in his direction. The teacher, in turn, looking at her, thought that she had an excellent physique. Gathering energy in his hand, he touched the ground and ice began to appear. A huge ice wall rose right in front of the running turtle. By hitting it directly with his head, he was able to break it. One of his heads was badly damaged. The other tried to eat our hero, but he managed to jump away. He broke everything in his path. Dust rose. Flying in the air, Guild Leader Mac thought that the wall was 10 meters thick and its strength exceeded the 8th level, but he was able to break it. Smiling, he thought that this was only the 5th level. Starting to gather his strength, he began to approach the turtle with incredible speed. A second later, he was already next to her. He had no time to react or defend himself. Jason struck with tremendous force and slashed the turtle. Victory again became our main character. As a result, our main character has already received a white snake crystal and a giant turtle crystal. At this time, people on Tsushima Island were screaming. One of the fighters told Elsa that most of the monsters in the area had been destroyed, and no second-level monsters had been found nearby. The girl, seeing the bird, extended her hand and then heard Jason's words. She shouted that they were going to Japan. The entire personal squad of our hero gathered around the table. Jason said that they would have to undergo thorough training. They did not have much time and experience there to defend themselves from enemy attacks. It is also impossible to know what is happening in other places. For now, it will be difficult for them to solve internal problems with their current combat power, even though they are threatened by Musashi and the 6 heads on both sides. Snakes that do not know how to distribute their forces for resistance. It was necessary to take the initiative into our own hands and begin preparations. Now there are no mass movements of high-ranking monsters throughout the country. 90% of all forces must be transferred to the south, and small groups should be left in different cities to protect the inhabitants, the major continued. He also said that once he penetrated Japan, the armored forces and the awakened were to move towards the island of Tsushima, in which case, he said that he would contact them. They should provide protection and be ready. Everyone stood up and looked at our main character, thinking that it was not in vain that they chose him. At that time, in the ancient places where the snake and the turtle reigned, people's footsteps could be heard. A large number of militants were in a hurry somewhere. As they ran closer, they saw a dead white snake. Taya's face was covered in sweat. He couldn't believe his eyes. Approaching the port, they saw a dead turtle. Everyone was shocked, because who could defeat such powerful creatures? It scared them. In the afternoon, everyone returned to the city hall. No one could believe what they saw. The soldiers who remained to guard the building were also shocked by the stories of their comrades. They started talking to each other about how nice it was here, but the others were unhappy and arguments began between us. The security of the building was increased. Everyone was wondering what was going on here. The manager was puzzled by the disappearance of the monsters, because who could kill them? When Jason suddenly appeared in the chair in front of him, the manager, in turn, didn't even notice him right away. As soon as he saw him, he quickly attacked our hero. The sword moved with incredible speed, bringing it closer to our hero's neck.